All right. Good evening. Welcome to the Corte Madera Planning Commission meeting for Tuesday, May 14th, 2019. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And the roll, Mr. Wolf.
Commissioner Metcalf?
Here.
Commissioner Bundy? Commissioner Chase?
Here.
Commissioner Lee?
Here.
Commissioner Bendell?
Here.
And the record will show Commissioner Bundy is absent at the moment.
Absent. Okay. At this point, we ask that anyone who wants to comment on something that is not on the agenda, you're welcome to step up to the microphone and take your 3 minutes. So if it's something that's not on the agenda, you can speak. Seeing no hands raised or no one rising, we'll close that section. And we'll go directly to our business item tonight. This is titled Accessory Dwelling Unit Ordinance Discussion. Review and discussion of proposed amendments to Corte Madera's existing accessory dwelling unit regulations. We will not be taking any specific action tonight. This is simply a discussion and to take public comment. So staff has prepared a significant and super report. So Martha or Adam, whoever is going to take the floor.
Martha, yeah.
Martha, please proceed.
Good evening, Chair Chase, members of the Commission. This evening, you'll be having a discussion on proposed amendments to Corte Madera's existing regulations on accessory dwelling units. And this presentation is meant to be interactive, so we'll be kind of taking breaks throughout the presentation for the Commission to give staff feedback on certain of the proposed amendments. And we've structured it into two different parts. The first part of the presentation will include background information and then an overview of the proposed amendments. And then following public comment, we'll get into some more details and have a further discussion. So in 2016, staff proposed substantial amendments to the town's ADU regulations. And this was in response to state legislation that was passed in 2016 and which took effect on January 1st, 2017. In October of 2016, the Planning Commission approved a resolution recommending that the Town Council adopt proposed amendments to Chapter 1831, the accessory dwelling units. And in December 6, 2016, the Town Council adopted two resolutions amending Chapter 1831. Planning Commission then presented an update to the Town Council in May of 2017 to provide an update on the ordinance and the type of applications that we had received. And in December 12, 2017, the Planning Commission had a discussion on the ordinance and considered some potential amendments at that time, but none were made. And we're here this evening to provide you with an opportunity to have a discussion on some proposed amendments. And as Peter mentioned, the Commission will not be taking any action at the meeting, but instead will be providing direction and feedback to staff. We'll take that feedback and then come back with a proposed amendment in the future. The purpose of Chapter 1831 is to comply with amendments made in 2016 to California Government Code Section 65852.2, which provides for local jurisdictions to set standards for the development of accessory units so as to increase the supply of smaller and affordable housing while ensuring that they remain compatible with the existing neighborhood. Now, since January 1st, 2017, there have been a total of 23 ADUs that have been approved in Corte Madera, and that includes the 8 that were a part of the Preserve project. This list shows 15 of the approved ADUs, so all with the exception of the 8 at the Preserves. And as you can see, they range in size, the smallest one being 491 square feet, and the largest being 1,195 square feet. And the ADUs that we've seen have been a mix of new detached structures, in addition to conversion of existing spaces such as basements and accessory structures. And the town is also currently reviewing applications for 3 ADUs, and those range in size. The smallest is about 350 square feet, and there's another one that's closer to 1,200 square feet. Now, we're here this evening to present some changes that are required based on state law that has continued to change, and also to discuss opportunities to improve the existing ordinance. And the changes are broken into 3 broad categories, which include changes to existing policy to better reflect the town's ADU goals, changes to clarify existing regulations, and changes that are necessary to comply with current state law. So the changes to existing policy that we've been considering are a change in the allowable size. So the current ordinance allows for an ADU up to 1,200 square feet, and we're recommending that be decreased to somewhere in the range of 950 to 1,000 square feet. The next change is to the allowable height. Currently, the height is established by the underlying zoning district, and staff is proposing to establish a height of 15 feet for an ADU or 25 feet if it is above a garage. The next proposed change is in regards to potentially allowing ADUs to be located in the rear yard and to allow an increase in lot coverage. And the fourth change is in regards to the location of ADU parking spaces when a space is required for an ADU, and also the replacement parking spaces when a garage is demolished in conjunction of converting that space to an ADU. And staff is proposing some additional flexibility on where those parking spaces are located. The next set of changes are to clarify existing regulations, and staff is proposing that several new definitions be added. In regards to public transit, staff proposes to establish the measurement of distance as a traversable distance. Currently, the ordinance does not define if the 1/2 mileage, if it's a radius or as the crow flies, or traversable. Also proposing to clarify that school bus routes would be included in the definition of public transit. And the third change is to define what an existing structure is in the Christmas Tree Hill Overlay District. And staff recommends establishing a 5-year time period in which someone could come and convert existing space into an ADU. The fourth change is for a 30-day rental requirement, to put that in the deed restriction. And the fifth change is to modify how the process that occurs if someone appeals the decision of the zoning administrator in either approving or denying an ADU. And lastly, the sixth change is regards to consistency with prior approvals. And this would require that an ADU not conflict with prior findings that were made for a discretionary permit. The last set of changes are to comply with state law. And the first is to establish a ministerial process for when an ADU is within an existing structure. The second change is in regards to the required parking, to modify it from 1 parking space per bedroom to 1 parking space regardless of the number of bedrooms. And the third is for architectural compatibility, to remove some of the design standards that are subjective in nature. And that concludes the first part of the presentation. And following public comment, we'll provide some additional information on these changes.
Okay, well, we'll start out by asking the other commissioners if they have any questions for you regarding this. Phyllis?
Not in general. There are certain ones I would like to discuss, but it isn't time yet.
Okay. Charles, do you have any questions for Martha?
Not at this time.
All right, Margaret?
When, in the first slide, when you were talking about the purpose of the,
There's
very purpose, while ensuring they remain compatible with the existing neighborhood, I think that's a little amorphous, so what do you mean by compatible with the existing neighborhood? Sure.
Is your microphone?
Did you hear me?
Yes. So the goal is so that they kind of blend in and fit in with the surrounding neighborhood in which they're proposed, and that they don't create impacts.
That's amorphous also.
It's a
I'm
general
trying-
goal. It's supposed to be amorphous. I mean, it's a general purpose of the, as you'll see in all of our sections of our ordinance, zoning ordinance, there's a general purpose that just outlines the broad goals and objectives.
I have a question then. If it's a ministerial approval, how, I'm not, it's a ministerial approval, and is the minister or the person making the decision going to make that decision that it's compatible with the existing neighborhood?
What was, as part of the ordinance amendment, staff is proposing to remove subjective design standards that currently are in the ordinance, and instead, application is evaluated based on objective standards.
So compatibility, like height or.
Oh, I see.
So, yeah, I mean,
Well,
there are.
She said though.
There are architectural review objective standards that we, and other development standards that are in the ordinance today and that are being modified and will still be in the ordinance moving forward. They are, there is no discretion in how those are administered, so it's either a yes, it meets it, or no, it doesn't. And that's part of what we'll be discussing tonight, if we have the right number of standards, objective standards in our ordinance now. But it should be very explicit and very clear that there can be no subjectivity in how those are administered. So it's a clear, and if you read through the ordinance, and we're definitely, and just so everybody's aware, we're going to go into much more detail on each of these things. I think that's going to be a very significant and long conversation. So especially given how many people are here this evening who probably want to speak on this, the idea was to sort of give an overview, and that's at the front part of this presentation, allow the public to speak, and then go into a deeper dive on several of these things.
So just to add to that, for Commissioner Bandel, and just to sort of set the stage, is when the town drafts new ordinances, it generally has an introductory purpose, but it is not a mandatory or criteria or anything that has to be met. It's just a general that it just has to comply with state law, and it just sets for a general purpose. As the planning director and senior planner indicated, that there is criteria built into the existing ordinance, as well as the proposed changes that would actually establish the criteria. So it isn't incumbent on the zoning administrator or whoever approves a ministerial permit to, there is no criteria built into this purpose.
I see. Well, I can talk about it later.
You feel like that's been addressed for the moment, Margaret?
For the moment.
Okay. So in your chart comparing Corte Madera and California standards, you point out that the Corte Madera standards are subjective, right? I would guess that that's your point, is that, and that the draft ordinance makes them objective, so that the subjective things of architectural style and form, details, color, materials, lighting, privacy, views, sunlight, landscaping are subjective. And you're converting those to California objective standards of parking height, setback, lot coverage, landscape. Architectural review is the one exception, maximum size. So those are all definable, quantifiable pieces.
Correct.
Okay. So Margaret, in that proposed ordinance, and I think this is for discussion, the architectural review element number 6 on the California standard list is what would become that, shall we say, wonky discussion.
Okay, I'll leave my wonks for later.
Right. But to your point, I think it then is the administrator's choice of what to apply.
Yes, with feedback, obviously, from the commission and council.
Well, that was one of my points of clarity for this initial discussion. I wanted to ask just how many ADUs are permitted on Christmas Tree Hill? Does anybody know?
It varies by district. It's generally 2 to 3 per district within Christmas Tree Hill, and it's broken up into maybe 8 or 9, I believe, somewhere between 8 and 10 different districts.
Okay, I didn't know there were districts within Christmas Tree
Yeah,
Hill.
there's a map actually that breaks up Christmas Tree Hill into different zones, and as Martha said, per the zone, you can have either 2 or 3 per zone, and I just don't have the exact number, but it's roughly 30 to 35 or so.
And are you proposing to do away with that standard or keep the standard? You're keeping the standard?
Keep the
Okay.
standard.
But as we'll talk about, state law does the changes, and we talked about this actually in 2016. There are implications for our ability to limit the number of ADUs in Christmas Tree Hill, and specifically if they're built within an existing structure on Christmas Tree Hill. We cannot prohibit those. Those must be permitted, and therefore those would not count against that zone limitation.
Okay. And my only other question was the definition of public transit, and I thought I read somewhere that a school bus route that was only for a specific school would not count toward.
Correct.
Okay. Yes, Phyllis.
The state definition does not refer at all to school bus transit, and I think it's something we have to discuss. This is one of the reasons I voted against in the past, and I will vote against any ordinance that includes the transit, because we have not gotten a definite answer from the state. And when we get to this part, as you get to that number, this is what I was referring to when you ask about the all-over. I will explain the difference and why, even if a transit district runs a school bus, it is different than public transit, and I will give you the information as I know it. I am waiting to hear from Legislative Council in Sacramento. I had thought staff was doing it, and by the time I found out they weren't, and I got in touch with them, they were busy there. They have to work first for the legislature and working on bills up there and defining them. So I kind of have to wait my turn as a member of the public, even though they answer only legislators, but it's the
Right.
legislator.
Okay. Well, you know, the maps in our packet,
Show
attachment
both.
6 and 7, one is with excluding school bus routes and one is
Correct.
including school bus routes. It's,
And my feeling is we should go without including school bus routes until we have a definite answer from the state. And at that time, if they say, yes, it's included, which I doubt very much, then we can amend the ordinance. But not to write the ordinance including it, to then take it out afterwards. And after we have, I know of one ADU that was allowed not to have a parking space
Right.
because of it, and I don't know see a bunch of them, and then we say, no, they're not allowed.
okay, well, we can take that up later. Suffice to say that school routes included incorporate a lot of East Corte Madera where otherwise it doesn't. So there's a big difference between what it does or does not include.
Except it depends
And-
upon when they run.
I think we have a lot of information in the
Yeah.
attachments that I just think would be helpful to make sure that, obviously the commission's aware, but also for the public, some of the things that we're talking about here. There are a couple of maps that were included, and I think attachment
6 and 7 have it.
6 and 7, one that shows a map of a half-mile radius from public transit stops, bus stops, not including the quote-unquote school bus routes, which again are operated by Marin Transit Authority and anybody can ride. And the other one that shows the bus stops that include those routes 113 and 117. And so that's obviously one of the things we wanted to discuss with the commission when we get to that point. We know that's been raised in the past, and obviously that's going to be a discussion item to continue. So
You don't happen to have those on slides, do you?
I do.
Do you?
Yep.
Okay.
we'll, yeah.
Oh, okay. So we'll put them up later. All right.
Slides for what?
6 and 7. Yeah.
Oh, the map.
Okay. Well, being that this is not a typical format for the commission, and we can we're not making a decision, we're really taking your input and discussing it tonight. I think we'll go right into hearing what the members of the public would like to say about this issue. But we won't change the rules that are 3 minutes for each speaker. And I'm going to time it with my iPhone if I remember to time it, and I will say, please excuse me, your time is up. So how many people would like to say something? Okay, got a good half a dozen. So we have to make sure that the microphone is functioning. And then we'll start out with whoever would like to begin the process. So jump up and speak, please. Would love to hear your comments.
I don't have a lot of comment because I really don't know a whole lot about this, but I would like to see something included in the regulations about Hidden Valley. It's up the hill, Upper Sausalito, Fairview, Alta Way, Alta Terrace, and we have very narrow roads up there, and egress is really difficult. We're dealing with that from the fire danger. So I would hope that there'd be some limitation on the number of ADUs that would be allowed up there on that hill, given what the existing situation is versus what that would impact it even more so. So again, I don't know what the Christmas Tree Hill ones are, but I would like to make sure that there's something addressed with regard to our area up in Hidden Valley. It's important.
All right, just for the record, would you mind saying your name? Thank you.
Sorry, Lucinda Smith. I
Thank
live
you.
here in Corte Madera.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. My name is Bill Rose, 104B Palm Avenue. By way of background, I am not only a resident of Corte Madera, a homeowner, I also own an ADU. I'm also a practicing city planner. I work for the city of Santa Rosa. I supervise the current planning division. To that end, I read a lot of staff reports, and my hat is off to staff. This was one of the best staff reports that I've read. It was complete, it was concise, it had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it was really, really a good staff report. So I wanted to talk about 3 items tonight: height, floor area, and owner occupancy. And so I'll just dive right into height. I see that there's a proposal to reduce the height, and I think that that's a good thing. The underlying base zoning district is pretty tall, and you could certainly have some impacts from that. One suggestion that I would have is this. I'll just give a brief background. When I built my house, 1,200 square feet, it had to go through design review. And through that process, interaction with the neighbors, the height was reduced to 20 feet. That's pretty low for a 2-story home, but it allowed me to get a loft, it allowed me to use some space, but it also was sensitive to the neighbors. So I would suggest a height limit, but something that could allow a loft space or some form of a second floor space, but with a lower height. So 25 feet is the proposal, one above a garage. Maybe there's some middle ground, maybe between 20 and 25 feet. The next thing is floor area. 1,200 square feet is currently allowed. There's a proposal to go a little bit lower than that. I think that the 1,200 square feet is currently, it's regulated. Floor area in Corte Madera is a regulation. It's proportionate to the lot size. And by the record, you're seeing that not every proposal is going to take full advantage of that. I think that you have to remember that every square foot you put towards an ADU, you're taking from the primary residence. As a homeowner, as an ADU owner, you're making those decisions. You're trading off how much square footage you want to give up in your primary house to your second unit. And it's all based on the lot size, setbacks, lot coverage. It all factors into it. So I think they're already regulated. The last thing is owner occupancy. I think that's one of the most important things. We see that the state is looking at that very carefully right now. There are multiple bills pending, and removing the owner occupancy restriction is certainly something that will be discussed. It may come from the state. We may get that directive here in the next few months. We'll know. It gives a lot of flexibility to the property owner. Also, we've had several units in in this town for a number of years, and we've had a number of tenants that I think are great members of this community. Veterinarian, NASA scientist, business owners, business executives.
That's rude.
Man.
Very simply and very quickly, I just think that the change of our community is changing. Renters are an integral part of our community, and they don't impact negatively the fabric of the community. I think that's been the core of why we've had owner occupancy restrictions.
Let me ask you a question. You think that the owner occupancy should be removed in favor of
Correct.
allowing an absentee owner to have a separate ADU unit?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Peter, do you have a choice of another?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Chris Erlin. I'm an owner of a home here in Corte Madera as well, and am considering doing some expansion for myself to get a second bathroom in my home, and in the process would like to build on an ADU so that my mother can age in place with me. And honestly, I'm about to choose not to do that because of the owner occupancy requirement. I think it's a poison pill in the system that is a very significant negative for me to consider investing in the growth of my home and the community, as to the previous speaker speaking to the fact that our renters could be great additions to our community. To say that my deed is now going to have a black stamp on it that says it must be owner occupied, I think it would reduce the value of my home. So I'm making decisions based on that I think is antithetical to what the state has required and that what we as a community should have. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Hi, my name is Corinne Grant. I live at 1161 Meadowcrest, top of Horse Hill. I first came to the Planning Department about 17 years ago trying to build an ADU so my parents could live with us. To say that I was met with an unfriendly response is putting it mildly. So we did not go ahead because the requirement was 750 square feet, which was too expensive to build per square foot, quite frankly. My parents had to live elsewhere. They had to spend a fortune. Eventually, we moved them into Aegis at $150,000 a year. So now we have 3 grown children. We've lived on our property for 30 years. We have just under 2 acres. We have one of our daughters is a single parent. Will probably never be able to afford a house in Marin. We would very much like to build a house on our property. Under the current guidelines, we can't subdivide. So I obviously don't like the owner occupancy requirement either. I want options. It's my property, my land. I've paid the property taxes for 30 years. I am in favor of keeping the 1,200 square feet, minimizing and speeding the process, the cost to build an ADU. I don't know if you want to base the square foot on the size of the lot. That's fine. We meet all those requirements for parking, et cetera. But I just find that we need diversity in our community. I've lived in Marin since 1976 and seen it change. And to put it mildly, we're getting a smaller and smaller cross-section of people living here. And if my husband's retired, I'll retire in another 5 years. We'd kind of like to stay here. But so many of our peers have had to cash out and move elsewhere. If we could get some more mileage out of our property that we've held on to for years, it would make a big difference to us. So I'm not sure of all the requirements. I like the ones that get rid of the subjective requirements. When I read through them this last time when I approached the town, it had to match the style of my house. They both would have to be stucco, things like that. I would like to see more leeway in. So I'm here to say I hope that you keep the larger size house. It was still in Corte Madera. Oftentimes that's considered not a large house. People are building them bigger and bigger. I see all the changes that have been going on in the neighborhoods. So, and I hadn't considered the height requirement. I'm not sure what 15 or 25 feet looks like, but I'd like as much leeway in that, of course, working with neighbors so we wouldn't restrict views or sunlight or anything like that. But that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Phil Simon, 4 Simon Ranch Road in Corte Madera. My sister and I own 5 conjoined parcels, zone medium density. And these parcels are entirely surrounded by open space. The largest parcel is just over 75,000 square feet with only a barn, a cow, and a few goats. The other 4 have single-family residences. The largest floor to area ratio is 13%. The smallest is under 5%. I live on this particular parcel, and I'm strongly considering an ADU. All the houses on the property are rentals. I formally rent my house for myself. We have a wallpaper hanger and a lift driver renting houses there, both of whom have lived there almost 20 years. My family began renting houses on the property in the 50s. We built all the houses, built all the houses, and maintained them professionally ourselves. So I do not want the town to place deed restrictions on us that others with considerably less experience in the county have avoided in this town. I don't want my ability to build a well-sited ADU resulting in a quarter of the allowable FAR restricted by an unreasonably square footage ceiling. I know the staff has thought that there could be some discretion in larger parcels, retaining a 1,200 square foot ADU. I also believe the town could allow me to build 2 ADUs on this site. I believe California allows it. And the resultant floor area ratio would be under 15%. I have no intention of doing this myself, but if it seems reasonable on my property, it should be allowed if it meets the intent of the legislature and doesn't cause a nuisance in the neighborhood. It should be allowed for my family and my heirs. The height restriction reasoning is views, sunlight, and privacy. If these aren't a factor and the building was made more attractive by being somewhat taller, I think it should also be allowed.
All right, thank you very much. Next.
Hi, I'm Jim Robinson, 25 Ash Avenue. We are homeowners of 22 years. We are not in the process of developing an ADU or junior dwelling unit, accessory dwelling on our property, so we may have a little bit different perspective. With regard to state requirements, I am concerned about eliminating the permit and courtesy noticing requirement for ADU and to reduce fees. I think it's ironic that we would continue, I believe, to notify adjoining property owners of home occupation permits, but not of those that might be expanding or their use of their property. And I think that's important for at least the people to be aware of that. And with respect to my own neighborhood, where the last home sold for $2.1 million, $2.2 million, and $1.5 million, I'm not sure that eliminating a fee is critical of the town's financial resources. In fact, I would think that those that have the wherewithal to build an ADU, that they would not find that cumbersome. I do not favor the reduction in parking requirements for a variety of reasons. I do favor the deed restriction for a 30-day rental, but believe town needs to really specifically go look at the Airbnb and look at some of the restrictions that Tiburon and Sausalito has done. I know we promised to visit that after our housing element was completed, but I don't believe we've done that yet. I would support the ADU maximum unit size be reduced to 950 square feet, although it still seems large for those of us who live in Madera Gardens on relatively small lots and small homes. Some are 1,400 square feet, so to add a 1,200 square foot ADU seems substantial. I'm opposed to exempting an ADU or a portion of ADU from lot coverage, and it's included in the staff report, wasn't mentioned regarding allowing a portion of an ADU from lot coverage and allow it to be located within the rear yard. I think that's something that the Planning Commission should seriously look at. I'm opposed to allowing the required parking for an ADU to be allowed as a tandem space on an existing driveway. I measured my driveway 20 feet from the garage door to the sidewalk. A Honda SUV or Honda CRV, which is their smallest SUV, is 15 feet long. So putting 2 cars on that would be blocking the sidewalk. And I can't imagine the dynamics or logistics of someone who owns a home or maybe a tenant in the home sharing a parking lot and, parking space and working tandem. I think that would be cumbersome. So therefore, I think the car would end up on the street. And I invite you to drive down Willow some night after a planning commission meeting. It turns into a one-way street, essentially, because of the amount of parking that exists in our community. Under the category of other considerations of the staff report, I'm concerned about the potential elimination of owner occupancy requirement. I respect those that have larger properties and the need concerns about deed, and maybe they have issues relative to being an LLC and future of the property and so forth. But I am concerned about the impacts of having a home being rented in an area like Madera Gardens with small lots, small homes, and no one there that really owns the property can consider it. We had a neighbor rent his house just 2 months ago. Within a week, they had $30,000 worth of damage to their home. One last thing, if I could. I recognize the dilemma the state and town face to provide additional housing, but dramatically increase the density in the town of less than 10,000 residents at 4 square miles in a county where almost 60% of the land area is open space represents a unique problem, the cookie-cutter approach to providing additional housing. In addition, seniors always looked at as a need. If you look at the senior citizen survey, 90% of the seniors in town own their properties. 80% said they would not be renting out any portion of their home. 89% expect to be able to continue to afford their own housing, and 75% would not create a junior second unit. So if you're looking for seniors to help support the ADU development, it doesn't seem to be, and based on the fact that we haven't had an application yet, I don't expect to see that in the future. But I do recognize the need for more housing in the county, and particularly in the town of Corte Madera, and I wish the Planning Commission well in dealing with this sort of weighty issue that you have before you.
Thank you, Jim. I have a quick question. You said something about the backyard.
I'm concerned the change from 25 feet to 10 feet. Now, a lot of properties in Madera Gardens, that may not be a problem, but I'm just thinking of the neighborhood issues relative to a second unit being that close to the backyard, depending upon what uses are on the other side of the yard.
And the overlying requirements will, existing zoning requirements will override that. Is that correct?
Well, one of the changes you'll be considering is allowing an ADU to be within a portion of the rear yard area.
Okay.
That's a consideration that's being discussed in the report, but I don't believe that's a state requirement at this point in time.
All right. Thank you, Jim.
But I do
very
have
much.
concerns about that. I'm sure there are other neighbors that do have concerns too. Thank you.
All right.
Good evening. Phyllis Galanis, 215 Prince Royal Drive, Corte Madera. I have one thing, well, two things. I'm concerned, as Lucinda expressed in her area, with the addition of cars parking on the side of the road where you've tentatively approved 159 to build an ADU at the bottom of their property. Where they can't have off-street parking. We already have to wait now for drivers coming up the hill. We have to pull over if we're going down and allow them to come up. You can't just pass each other on our road. I also have a real concern about you allowing 113 and 117, which are school buses, to take the place of public transportation. Imagine you've run down the hill to get to your bus at 7:24 in the morning, and you miss it. And you call your boss and say, I missed my bus. I'll be sure to get there as soon as the next one comes, and that'll be tomorrow morning at 7:24. There aren't pickups like there are with normal public transportation. And to say that you can use that, I think, is erroneous. I can't imagine the state saying, "Oh, that's fine." So I have a real main issue with that. And that, of course, would negate the 159 being able to be built, which, of course, I don't think should on our hillside anyway. But I wanted to make sure that the transportation got into your discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis.
Hi, Tamila Fariju, resident of 163 Prince Royal Drive. My concern is about the safety in our neighborhood. We live in the area that in case of emergency, we have just 2 corridors of refuge. And Constitution Drive is a very narrow street, and on the hillside, in case of emergency, there is kind of difficult to pass through that area when we add more resident as ADU resident in our neighborhood. I actually lost my car in flood, and I know what the situation can be in case of not even major disaster. Very simple, passing through narrow area is not easy in kind of emergency situation. And the second is the safety. On the hillside, we have landfill, and we have fire road on the hill, which for many years, any structure on those areas was not legal. And nowadays, for ADU purpose, I have no problem to bring more residents in our area, but for that specific location, which is hillside, landfill, I don't know why in the first place it can be accepted the family go through all the designs. The first thing is to review the safety, and the rest can be followed after. And the third is, of course, school bus. School bus, in definition, might be a transportation that can run all the time. But no, in weekend, in summer, they're not running. In regular hours, they're not running. In afternoon, evening, they're not running. That is something that we have to review, not just by definition of bus, by a schedule. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who else will stand up and say something about ADUs tonight? Hi.
Hi. My name is Nathel Bellany, and we're residents here in Corte Madera and also work here at the school. My husband and I have spent a lot of money trying to do an ADU here, and we've been denied. And we would love to be able to do it for my mom. She's getting older and needs something, but with all the laws and restrictions that are in place, you're making it really difficult for us to be able to do that for my mom, which is very disappointing. Our lot is unique. We live on Buena Vista. It's a very wide street. We own, our lot space in front of us. We have a lot of parking. I think when you look at some of these people's plans for ADUs, you need to look at their specific lot that they have. You need to come visit the property. You just cannot deny it without looking at lots, because everything here in Corte Madera is so unique. So things need to be looked at a little bit better. I think that you need to make it easier on people and not so expensive. Architects, planning, surveys, it's outrageous. We need to help people in our community. We want to help our family. Please help us do that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Please. Okay, I don't think there's going to be any takers here, so we'll close that section of this and come back to the staff and the dais. We got some good comments, so thank you very much. I appreciate hearing all that, and I'm sure staff has paid close attention to some of that. So it comes down to some very important and significant issues that you identified. several speakers spoke about the owner occupancy requirement. And you're proposing to essentially leave that with a twist in the language, is that correct?
So at this time, staff is not proposing any changes to remove the owner occupancy requirement. And to clarify, so that everyone's aware, the owner occupancy requires that the owner reside in either the primary dwelling or in the ADU. And then the other one can be rented out.
Okay, and that is state law?
Current state law, there is a piece of legislation that,
Is it-
it doesn't require it, but it doesn't preclude someone from requiring it.
All right.
Yeah, there is a current bill that the legislature is considering that would remove that requirement.
So they're bringing it to the table, in which case then we'd have to draft an amendment
Correct.
and take that out.
As staff pointed out in their in the staff report, there's several pieces of legislation. Every legislative session since 2017, since after ADUs were adopted, there's been proposed legislation. It's unclear now. We're not asking or suggesting that Planning Commission should wait. If it were adopted, it would likely be effective January 1, 2020, so there'd be plenty of time to come back and amend. So based on what we know now, staff is suggesting that you consider current state law, which allows a local jurisdiction to place an owner occupancy restriction. But that's certainly up for discussion.
Peter?
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, Phil, who is not here tonight, mentioned that up in Sonoma County, or Petaluma where he lives, they had taken out that restriction. And I'm wondering if the man who is here, who said he works in planning, if he could verify if I'm correct. Because Phil, when he was talking to me, said that removing that restriction really allowed them to have more ADUs and meet some of their requirements for new housing, et cetera. So if I may have that man comment.
Yeah, you can certainly.
Santa Rosa isn't a county, Sonoma is, but I want to hear what he knows about removing that restriction because Phil is not here to ask.
All right.
Sure, I'm happy to respond with respect to the city of Santa Rosa.
Yeah.
So we similarly went through an ordinance change about a year ago. We're constantly chasing the state laws, and we probably will be doing that again next year as well. This item came up. Previously, Santa Rosa did not have an owner occupancy requirement. The city council ultimately decided to implement one, but with a bit of a caveat, and that is when the property owner agreed to enter into an affordability contract with the city, then the owner occupancy could be removed. So it was basically a trade-off to say that you could have no owner occupancy restriction provided one of your units is essentially an affordable unit.
All right. Thank you very much.
And I'll just add, I mean, there are several jurisdictions that don't have don't have owner occupancy requirements. San Anselmo, for example, does not and has not for many years required owner occupancy. That's an example of one.
In staff's opinion, then, how does that impact this, durability and function of this ordinance as a viable additional dwelling unit, direction to able people to get into building these things?
I think it's clearly, this is one of the reasons why we want to revisit it and have the public conversation, because I think it's really about what flexibility, it's additional flexibility, put it that way. And we've heard from several people in the public this evening that would help enable them to build an ADU without that requirement. It doesn't change in any way sort of in terms of, I guess, the effectiveness of the rest of the ordinance or any other aspects of the ordinance. Obviously, it means that you may, I think this is why it's sort of a policy decision. It's sort of like, how aggressive does the town want to be on sort of the perspective of encouraging the development of these ADUs. I think it's clear that if you do not require owner occupancy, it's one less restriction, so you will only get more rather than less ADU developed, all other things being equal in terms of the other regulations. So, you know, I think it's something that staff could further explore or look for other, you know, and then talk to other jurisdictions who have had that, such as San Anselmo, and see what their experience has been regarding maybe some potential issues or other concerns that have been raised in those communities. But there's, I think we've talked about in the past, it's not entirely clear. We've gone through our own legislative record to understand where that requirement came from, but have not found any specific intent or language that would lead us to say this is exactly why Corte Madera adopted this owner occupancy requirement in the first place. We can speak to general assumptions that we may have, but we don't have that specific record from our own legislation.
So I'm going to ask the other commissioners in a moment what they think might be the implication of removing that, or, you know, adopting or keeping it in, because I think the fear is, this is perceptual, not factual, that rentals will become higher priced. It'll drive up the cost, because people will say that it makes for good rentals, so that they can get market value out of that. So is that the fear of taking off the owner occupancy, or what is the reason for it?
You know, I think there's a couple of things. One is sort of just a character thing. Now it's sort of, if you have a single-family residential neighborhood, which obviously single-family residential neighborhoods may have they have houses for rent all the time, but I think the character would potentially change to having 2 units on a lot, such as more like that are for rent with no owner supervising, I guess, the tenants that may live there or be located elsewhere, and how attentive they may be to the concerns around there are in question. Now, again, I don't see that as much different than a current owner of a single-family home who happens to rent their own single-family house and live somewhere else, which is currently allowed in Corte Madera, obviously. I think other potential concerns could be that just along those lines of maintenance of, you know, do they have the proper, it's the same, I think it's the same concerns you may get with somebody who rents a single family home in the neighborhood. How attentive is that landlord or that individual to the neighborhood concerns and things such as maintenance of the property and so on.
So unintended consequences. Phyllis, what's your thought? Question?
I like the idea that was adopted in Santa Rosa,
right,
that the unit would be affordable, because that is the area where we usually have the problem. We're not going to have a lot of the preserve and 8 units, you know, added on to very expensive rental homes. And I think it's something we can look at. I mean, as far as the maintenance of the property, there are a lot of small apartment houses that might have 6 or 8 units. You don't have the owner living in one. They don't waste the income from that to have a manager living there. And people are either going to take care of it or they're not. And believe me, when people start acting up in an apartment, the other neighbors are contacting the owner darn fast. So I think it's something we could look at, but we could say that the restriction could be lifted in the case that it falls into one of the affordable categories. I think it's something that would be of benefit to the people who work in this town and to the town itself in meeting the state requirements.
Okay. Charles, your thoughts about this owner occupancy, or any fears, or what would be your concern about removing it, or for that matter, keeping it in place?
I'm conflicted, right? Because part of it is I live in the community, and I do think that by making it owner restricted, it has oversight over neighbor relations and also the property. As someone who's rented to people before, I do believe that it has that, and as a community character, we can define that. But then it's also in conflict with the overall concept of the ADU, and so there's the public's kind of need and desire for community in that way, but then there's also the property owners and this kind of larger state dialogue about just creating more rental properties. I do think that the Santa Rosa ordinance is within the spirit of both the state and trying to free up, but once again, there are property owners that don't want to see any of that here, and I completely understand that as well, as someone who just wants to see less kind of burdensome regulations on property, because market dictates, like, the more freedom, the more ability you have to do more with it, and so I respect that as well. And so I'm conflicted, honestly. I don't know that I fully have an opinion right now that I could make a judgment in either one of those directions, honestly, on that.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but it's just for discussion right now.
That's important
we'll
to say, yeah.
Forced into it later.
Margaret, how do you feel about the maintaining the owner occupancy or relieving it? And are there things to worry about with either one?
I think I'm conflicted also. I think I have to think a lot more about it, but right now I'd be leaning towards owner occupancy.
And for what reason?
Because in my experience, I think that a property is maintained and kind of the neighborhood better regulated by people who have an ownership interest in a property being on site.
Okay. It is a double-edged sword, because I think that if you limit the income a property provides, calling it, low income, then that makes it less attractive to develop, and that drives up the price of those homes that do have those available for rent. It does then limit the stock by saying it's got to be low income. I don't know if we're at a place where the market makes any sense, because if you then built all the ADUs you could, would that then keep the price of those ADU rentals down? You look at San Francisco and the prices are not particularly dropping, even though they're building houses like crazy. So I'm not sure. I think that there's a problem with having absentee owners. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we can definitely look into the Santa Rosa example some more. We have a good resource in the audience, and we can reach out to him as a colleague as well. I would just say, not having gone into, and I'd be curious what the experience has been. It's only been a year, I guess, up there, but elsewhere who may have these requirements for affordability. As we talked about with a recent project, there's a little different there. But my concern with affordability requirements is one, it is a significant sort of administrative burden for the homeowner who may not be familiar with rules and regulations, and also obviously the town would have to figure out how to incorporate and adopt its own enforcement mechanisms and agreements with each individual owner and the property, which is fine. It can be done. I think it's introducing a whole nother sort of administrative sort of scheme into the equation, with usually is handled by big property management organizations. Such as that we've seen in town recently, who do rental agreements and affordability agreements, which are significant legal documents with the town, for example.
I also had a question for staff about the legislation that's currently being considered. So if it is enacted, does it retroactively strike it from the deeds that were already encumbered with that? Because I think that's a big deal that we're...
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't know if we know the answer to that. Do you?
We won't know that until we see the actual final legislation and whether it speaks to that, whether it
Do you know who's crafting it? Could we reach out to them and see what their position is on that?
Again, it's gonna.
Like 6 of them.
What we're
Okay.
recommending at this point is that you should make your decisions based on the current legislation. If the legislation were to change this legislative session or next time, we can bring that back and we'll know more and be able to answer those questions. But there's really no way to even know prospectively.
I think also if they're crafting it, by having a dialogue with them, it sets us up to inform for the public and everyone else maybe what would be in the best interest of that legislation.
Yeah, and that's
So
a
why-
different issue, and there's lots of mechanisms through the California League of Cities, of which the town is a member, and other legislative processes, and that's certainly separate direction than just giving staff direction on how you wish to proceed on this
Coordinate.
issue.
Right, but we're having an overall dialogue about ADUs, so, and to me, I think that would be something that I personally would like to encourage you to reach out and talk to them, so, that being said, whether you do or not. Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
We have to stay with what we know right now. So-
Yeah.
I was going to suggest that since our own state Senator McGuire is working on a bill right now, and he's even gotten Weiner to add some of his things into the bill and kind of calm Weiner's way out there, and it's that maybe we should ask for a copy of the bill. I mean, you can get online and make sure each of us is emailed a copy of it. And if you don't know how to read it, look for the Legislative Council's explanation of it, because it can get pretty tedious. But that explains where McGuire is going at this time, and it looks like a bill that
But that's a
is
total, just to be
positive.
clear, that's a totally different bill than the ADU bills that are out there.
Right,
Going
but
to-
it shows his overall picture of what he's looking at. We've got things coming from Gavin Newsom. There are about 6 different bills going right now, and at least 4 of them have to do with ADUs or JADUs, and
Right. So
everybody wants to get in on the act.
There are, we can look them up, they're available, they're
Yeah.
on the legislative site, right? Okay. So,
But it's definitely so, it sounds like it's something that you would like staff to definitely further investigate and consider and look for as much analysis as we can
Please,
on
yeah.
sort of the experiences of other communities
Right.
and potential pros and cons with an approach.
I would make this statement about what I'm hearing from the other commissioners, and that is that we are wanting to encourage the ADUs, and yet we don't want to risk an element that backfires on the town for reckless ownership or inadvisable conditions that we should have foreseen by enabling this removal of the owner occupancy. My street had a outcall service on it. And so, anything can happen. It happens in the town. So then one of the other elements that was brought up was the limiting of ADUs, right, in one area, and we have the Christmas Tree Hill area, and it sort of ties into parking and traffic and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I think if we can definitely make sure we hit on the Christmas Tree Hill sort of proposal, and there's parking as well we'll talk about, but perhaps we can go through, and Martha can go through some of the, looping back in and tying it to the staff report, these big policy discussions we wanted to have with you regarding the size and the height has come up a couple times. I think we should get to that. And there's a few others that Martha has outlined and sort of going through those
And
first,
parking.
and
parking.
public transit,
And public transit.
we'll get to all this stuff.
Could I just ask a
Yes.
question about, in general, Christmas Tree Hill, there are a number of limits that have been placed, not only ADUs. Is it because of the historic significance, or is it because of the size of the streets and the safety issues and the hillside condition? Why is Christmas Tree Hill singled out so many times?
It's because of the access and then the width of the roadways.
So it's
Well,
the public
it was really
byway.
So there was a special Christmas Tree Hill overlay zoning district that was created through a community plan process in 1991 or 2. It was like a several-year process where the residents up on the hill came together and decided that they needed to, wanted to adopt, for the reasons of the special character of there and the access and sort of some of those things, parking issues and the like, and also just steep hillside and how do you build a house with our zoning code on a hillside like that with front setbacks. It's many reasons, but they decided with the town staff to create a community plan and ultimately the council adopted a series and a set of regulations specific just to Christmas Tree Hill. One of those was limitations on accessory dwelling units. Because of, as you know, Christmas Tree Hill has one point in and out, which is Redwood right up by the stoplight for many hundreds of residences up on the hill. I don't have an exact number, but as much as reading back through the documents, I think the thinking at the time was there's a limitation on we have to limit. Not everybody. We can't have every house having an ADU up there just from a density standpoint. Parking may be an issue as well and things like that. So the zones were created and to try to create a fair system geographically on how many ADUs could be in a particular zone. And to this day, we keep a chart and a map and a listing of the ADUs that are up there. Like I said, though, previously the state is now, after the 2016 legislation, precludes us from using that system unless we entirely precluded ADUs from Christmas Tree Hill, but it precludes us from prohibiting somebody from converting an existing part of their house or an existing accessory structure into an ADU. And those units, therefore, don't count against that limitation, the zone limitation. Or sorry, the limitation on number of ADUs per zone.
Okay.
Excuse me, doesn't safety come into it at all? When you talk about what the state is coming up with, there's also a safety reason for Christmas Tree Hill and the one, access and the egress.
Oh, no, in the state, there is the town is allowed to prohibit entire areas from, with meeting and making safety, and I think there's health and safety findings, and they're pretty robust findings, but making those findings could say that there are particular areas of town that are just not appropriate for ADUs. We went through this and we explained that in 2017, and at the time there was decided by, Planning Commission recommended, and then the Town Council ultimately adopted the regulations that we proposed at that time, and did not want to make those findings, but also wanted to obviously keep track and see what issues were coming up over the years. And so that's where we went back in, I think, 6 months after their initial adoption and had a discussion about what we had seen in terms of ADUs being built and any particular specific issues attributable to them in particular areas. And we continue to sort of monitor that. But that is allowed to do. So that's why, anyways, that's, I think,
So specifically, there was a provision in the state law initially, and is still available, that each jurisdiction has an opportunity to designate an area where accessory dwellings may be permitted. The designation of an area is limited to a criteria that talks about water and sewer service and the impact of accessory dwelling units on traffic flow and public safety. So it's not quite as broad as we think in other land use decisions about, health and safety and welfare. It was very narrowly tailored under state law. And if you recall, the discussions at Planning Commission and the council is Christmas Tree Hill already was divided into zones and already had restrictions on second units. And just as a point of reference, Corte Madera's had an accessory dwelling unit ordinance, as has many statewide, for many, many years. This isn't new as of 2016 and 17. The state regulations were updated at that point, but the town has regulated second units for decades. So Christmas Tree Hill already had a scheme of restrictions on ADUs. There was certainly concerns to uphold that. There were special findings that Planning Commission made recommendations on, and Council ultimately made that findings and determination on the issues of the impacts to accessory dwelling units on traffic flow and public safety specific to the Christmas Tree Hill area. There may be other areas that the town wants to look at about restrictions. At the time in 2016 and 2017, when Council and the Planning Commission reviewed this, there was a decision that it was the purpose to encourage ADUs, try not to restrict them where possible, unless there were really extenuating circumstances.
Right.
If that's changed, then that's certainly something for discussion.
And I think also at the time, as you know, it was also, we had adopted a housing element in 2015, which talked about policies to encourage ADUs. As you know, recently we reported on how the town is meeting its current RENA allocation numbers entirely over the last year through the production of ADUs. So there was a decision not, this was one of the main strategies the town was going to use to actually meet its housing development goals over the course of, just from a policy standpoint and in also meeting its RENA allocation numbers from the state.
Right. But what was just read, what you read to us, and from what you said, is this an all or nothing situation? Because it sounded that way when you said it, that we either restrict an area from having them or we don't. And I'm wondering if, like with Christmas Tree Hill, the restriction is the number. It doesn't say, and I'm thinking of, it was Lucinda Smith brought up the Hidden Valley area, which I'm not familiar with. It's like, I'm not trying to say one way or the other. But if a situation exists that there could be a safety problem if every house had one or every other house had one, that you could say there are only X amount allowed within that area, is that a possibility?
Yes, because we have done it in Christmas Tree Hill. We feel that is, it's better than precluding it entirely.
Well, I agree.
But I will say that the findings that must be made must be very seriously considered, and there must be evidence to support the fact that is not an appropriate place to allow them, or that there's a limitation on specific areas for certain reasons, and that it would have to be analyzed and studied and brought forth.
And I think that's the distinction, is it has to be analyzed and studied. The really unique nature of Christmas Tree Hill, back when the council considered it in 2016, 2017, that had been studied as part of their overlay plan. It was in place. For a neighborhood to have that kind of analysis in depth is a very lengthy, costly procedure for the town to undertake or a neighborhood to undertake. And none of that information was available at the time that the council looked at these regulations in 2016 and 2017, other than the plan that was already in place for Christmas Tree Hill.
Oh, no, I understand that. I'm just wondering the possibilities, because first, the way you said it, I thought you were saying it's all or nothing, and I want to be sure I wasn't hearing it right.
So I think that given the fact that parking implements the traffic flow, that's one of the concerns, right? And then that an area has a problem. So safety is part of it. There are so many streets in the town that you have to pull over to let a car by. There are very few streets that you can have two cars go side by side anywhere. A lot of Chapman Park, up our streets, down here next to Town Hall, there's almost
most of the single-family neighborhoods are like
you cannot have two cars passing. It's just a fact of life. So that's a consideration that may equally weight out some of the neighborhoods, and it would be hard to say that some area should be limited because of that condition. right? Because it's kind of a universal condition throughout the town. But nonetheless, it's an important concept.
Well, could we move into
Yeah.
public transit now, because
Right.
it is a
I think so.
follow-through
Let's
on
go to,
that?
I'd like to follow the actual slides in the
Okay.
presentation that we prepared, if that's okay.
Certainly,
And we-
it wasn't great.
Just to
Okay.
limit it, and what we'll try to do is limit so we can get through it and get to public transit is actually try to limit it to 10 minutes and then 15 minutes max, and
Okay.
we can move on at that point.
All right. So, go ahead, Martha.
So size. So the current ordinance allows an ADU to be up to 1,200 square feet, and staff is proposing to reduce that to somewhere between the 950 and 1,000 square foot size. All things being equal, smaller units tend to be more affordable. And it is important to note that several of the ADUs that were proposed did exceed 1,100 square feet. And so there is a chance that those would not have been proposed if the 950 square foot would have been the threshold, because it's more costly to build. Another thing that staff has considered is allowing an increase above the 950 square feet through a discretionary review or based on lot size. I'd like to go over some of the maximum unit sizes of other jurisdictions in Marin County. So on average, what's allowed ranges between 700 to 800 square feet. Fairfax does allow a 1,200 square foot ADU, and there are some cities that have developed a two-tier approach where they establish a maximum size, and then you can get a discretionary permit and increase. San Anselmo does that. They establish the maximum size at 800 square feet, and then with the use permit, the size can be increased up to 1,200 square feet. And then San Rafael also has the same approach where they establish 800 square feet as the maximum size, and then with the use permit, it can be increased to 1,000 square feet. And Novato has taken a different approach. They establish a maximum size of 750 square feet, and then allow additional square footage based on the size of the lot. So those are some options that the commission could consider.
Up to a maximum of
1,200, and the state establishes 1,200 square feet as the maximum, so it cannot be above that. So the feedback we're interested in is what's the maximum size that should be allowed, and if the commission is interested in a two-tier approach, and if so, does discretionary review make sense, or should it be based on lot size or another factor?
Staff, commissioners, so I'm all for a two-tier approach. I think that's appropriate. Margaret?
I would say the same thing. I think that,
And would you lean toward the discretionary or toward a lot size formula?
I think, well, I don't know. It seems like discretionary review is pretty much shot down in every question with the ADU situation. So I would say two-tier approach.
Two-tier based on the lot size.
Lot size.
And staff did reach out to HCD to make sure that this approach is something that is consistent with state law, and they did not raise any concerns with establishing a maximum size and then allowing, with a design review, an increase above that.
All right.
In the two-tier approach, were you talking about the 750 or the 950?
I would say 900 probably myself.
900.
That's where I would start and then move up from there. That's how I would look at it.
I was going for the lower number, but.
See, other approach.
Yeah.
My other approach is a combination of both. So if you have 2-acre site, right, and it's, a 1,200, but if you have a 8,000, then it's pretty big on there, so setting that threshold where it could still be administrative so that it's not overly burdensome to anyone in large areas, but then as you get into the tighter communities where it really could have impact, that it does come in for discretionary review so that we don't get into the problems that we've had in the past. And so so I see that as that you could basically, match it.
So you're saying have an escalator based on the square footage and then another review process?
No, so that it would be that the lot size could be basically staff approved if it met a criteria. If it's over, a acre and and it meets the FAR and stuff, that it could just be approved. But if it's
Right.
under a certain amount of size, which, in these denser, suburban neighborhoods of the 1950s, or, residential that was tightly packed, it just thinking about the word, I'm not going to give it to you right now. You need to go back and look at it and see if there's a way to tool it. And if you can't, then, I'm going to err towards discretionary review, but I kind of want to give it so that we're releasing the burden of having to go through too much to get size things on large lots, because I hear a lot of the people saying that they have that desire. And
So if I understand that it's sort of, there is a space, whether it's 900, 950, 1,000 as a minimum baseline allowable ADU size, and then going above that, potentially up to 1,200, there could be one approach within that would be, if you're a big lot, you could get that, again, without discretion, but if you're in a smaller lot, you would have a design review or a use permit or one of those discretionary review applications.
I think that would address the issues the most, but
Since it shows the existing requests that have been approved.
The different towns?
Yeah, according to your- So.
So they range, so the smallest one was 491 square feet. And you'll notice a lot of the ones that were conversions of existing space, those tend to be smaller. Those are in, the 500 to, 600 square foot range. You see the larger sizes when it's a new detached structure. Those include the 21 Edison is just over 1,100 square feet. The 127 Grove was 948 square feet. And then 159 Prince Royal was 1,195 square feet. So the larger size ones tend to be the detached units, and the smaller sizes are when an existing space is converted.
So that was another thing I wanted to touch on, though, is given that they're really, when you go to do a whole new foundation and all these other kind of utilities and everything like that, that's where the price point becomes too burdensome and they want to max out, right? But then when it's the individual, and so to lump them all together and just say ADUs are regulated by the same kind of, that's the other thing that I'm interested in, that I didn't see the approach of, hey, there's ADUs that are inside, and that's where, in the other one where you see when San Anselmo, or they break it out for different percentages for each one and different sizing that's more appropriate too, and to encourage different types of those developments, and I haven't seen anything for me to digest how we might tack that, and so that, and I don't know how to do that, but I would like to at least see more dialogue about that, but.
And the current ordinance, if it's an attached structure, an attached ADU, it can't be more than 50% of the primary dwelling, of the square footage of the primary dwelling. So if your house was 1,200 square feet and you did an ADU attached to it, you'd be limited to 600 square feet.
Okay, and then is that also for the detached? There's no requirement?
It is not.
Okay, but then some of the other towns did have a relationship to the primary, to the detached unit?
Most of it, it's generally when it is an interior conversion. Although San Rafael,
I saw Sausalito. But it's the same.
it's the same, 50%.
Okay, so we're at a point where we agree on a two-tier approach, and we can bifurcate it by attached or detached to some degree, right? And that one is based on the square footage of the house, and the other is based on the lot size, right?
Are you going to call me to make
I
that
am,
up?
but I just wanted to get that clear.
Yes.
That's where we stand so far, as I get it. Okay. Phyllis?
Okay. I could go with having the two tiers. I'd like the base tier to be $950. I'll remind everybody, for a number of years it was $750 in this town, and when it came before the Planning Commission and we heard the state wanted $12, I think we got a little bit carried away looking at what has happened. Going back to that previous slide where you showed the choices. Yeah. Yes. With the two-tiered, discretionary review is too amorphous for me. If you want to have discretionary review, have some criteria set.
Well,
You don't
we're
just
talking about
say
this
it's
design review.
discretion. It's more than design review. It could be a number of things. That you look, lot size could be part of it. Setbacks could be part of it. You know, on the same lot, depending upon where it is put, what the setback is, etc. There are all sorts of things that would go into. Would still be staff review. It doesn't have to necessarily come to the Planning Commission, but I'm saying you just don't have this amorphous thing that's discretionary, have some criteria. I also think, and then it gets down to C, the other approach that has to do with the parking, which is, I know my cause celebrity, but if, and I'll just use 159, the example, it was found by staff that it did not need to have a parking space. Well, let's say under the current ordinance, it doesn't need a parking space, but they say they will put an on-site parking space to keep car being parked on the street. Then you can consider maybe making it a little bit larger or that type of thing. So that should be part of the criteria too. You look at different things, but it should be said, the burden shouldn't be on you, Adam, or any other staff member to have to come up with looking at something and go nuts trying to figure out, will this work, will this not work? So you've got to have some kind of a guideline for your own sake. It's not fair to staff. And I think that's something that should be developed, and that whether it's put into the ordinance or if it's written up and everybody has a copy of it to know, that would be the way it would work. But as I say, I think looking back, and we all voted for it, was unanimous, those of us who were on the commission at the time, that we thought the 1,200 was a great idea, affordable housing. We had all sorts of good reasons for going that route, and we're beginning to see we were wrong. I'll admit it.
One instance doesn't make the
No, it's not that one. There's more than one, and there's several. I mean, it was something that we didn't take a lot of things into consideration. We just took into the fact of making it more comfortable, moving things that were more affordable for people who work in the town to live in. And I think 950 should be the base and could go up to 1,200, the state thing, with defined criteria for the approach of adding on.
A way in which they can achieve additional square footage by meeting certain criteria.
Right.
Just like
the hotels and the thing.
other things. They have to do certain elements, and that's an item for open discussion, frankly, that you come back and say, here's a laundry list of things that could or may or may not. I mean, that can be a long list of stuff.
But it should be a burden on staff that
Okay,
when something comes up, they have to make a decision on each one separately in that sense.
No, the Minister of ADUs would have a headache, so we don't want to go there. All right. So.
Okay. Thank you. I think we have some good direction on size.
Next.
Appreciate that. Keep going, yeah.
Okay, so the next policy amendment is in regards to height. So the current ordinance does not establish a height standard other than what the underlying zoning district allows. And in the R1 zoning district, the maximum height is 30 feet. So staff is recommending establishing a reduced building height for ADUs, and what we've proposed is 15 feet or 25 feet if it's constructed above an either existing or proposed garage. And I've included some of the ADUs that have been approved or proposed and what their heights were. The detached ADUs on 21 Edison was 15.5 feet. 159 Prince Royal had a height of 12 feet. And then 45 Buena Vista Drive, which is currently being reviewed, has a proposed height of 13 feet. For the detached structures above a garage, Lupine Drive has a height of 16 feet 4 inches. 145 Grove Avenue has a height of 21 feet 8 inches, and 479 Montecito has a height of 16 feet 11 inches. So the majority of structures do fall within what staff has proposed. So we're looking for feedback from the commission on what the maximum building height should be for an ADU, both if it is over a garage or not.
And I'll just chime in. One of the reasons why we were looking at this was because this goes to how do we make our development standards for ADU objective, meaning that we have very clear black and white whether it meets it or not, while still, and this goes to, I think, Commissioner Bendel's earlier point, while still maintaining sort of this, a sense that these structures aren't likely, and there may be examples where they do, but they aren't likely to create sort of impacts or they're within the character of the existing sort of single-family character where these things may be built or the ADUs may be built. So I think this sort of links up with the fact that we I think we are strongly recommending that we have to modify some of our existing code that sort of has this discussion about, for example, the way that the views one was previously written. There's stuff about, we had that's the significant one. There are sunlight discussions as well. So lower structures, obviously, when you take into effect setbacks, are not going to cause the impacts related to potential shadows that taller structures may. So I think it should be kind of viewed in conjunction with these other objective criteria that are also up for discussion, clearly. But that's where this is coming from, to sort of start to constrain some of the physical form to a certain extent of a structure without, because as we know, these are ministerial, these are not going to be, there's not going to be any review in terms of the potential impacts that they may have other than what we write into the code as a black and white yes or no answer.
All right, well, let me just ask about a house, say it's on stilts, and it's got the first floor 10 to 15 feet above grade, and they want to put in a room on the side of the house that becomes an ADU. So immediately, you can't, you put a 15-foot box on the side of the house, it's going to look awful. So you want it to conform to some architectural standards, so to make it, even if it dropped down from the existing building was a little smaller, it might end up being 20, 25 feet tall off of grade. So I agree with that point. It just might limit some things to be architecturally acceptable on all these hillsides. I don't know. That's my thought about that. While I agree.
You can see clarity with that because there might be developmental standards that say that the where you set the first floor of the building is actually where the massing's counted as far as height in those permits, right?
Yeah, that example wouldn't be allowed. You couldn't do an attached ADU in that case. You'd have to set it somehow down in the lot on the slope.
Yeah.
Right.
Or above the garage. That would be the other location.
I mean, I had even more about that, right? Like, so, what's not said here is the assumption that all ADUs are one story. Right, because I've seen a lot of more exotic ADU exploration with 3D printing and stuff and they're doing 2-story. I mean, NASA just had this big thing about the Mars 3D printed, and they're 2-story little beehive looking things. And if we're going to limit the setbacks or the FAR, or basically lot coverage, and they just can't put a sprawling 1-story down there, the option to go up might allow them to do it, even though it's tight and they have to go, but at least if we are going to say that it's 1-story, say that it's 1-story, right? Because 15 feet is somewhere in between. It's like storage and lofty space, but not quite enough to make it fully livable. So either set what a 1-story and 2-story limits are, or be clear about what the expectation is at those heights is one thing that I'd like to think about.
Yeah, but
that's a tough nut to crack.
Through on what Charles said, if the neighborhood is 1-story homes, you don't want a 2-story ADU. There has to be, the ADU should not end up being taller than the house itself. And yet when you look at the garage, I mean, we've had enough complaints of people upset when applicants come before us, they add a 2nd story to their homes, and we've seen all sorts of pictures and drawings of what's happening with light and air and privacy. How do you add something very tall onto a garage when the homes are a certain amount? So I do think it would be okay if we did limit these ADUs to 1-story, and with an understanding that when you're building over a garage, it is going to be taller.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and actually, I think that one of the things we were considering is, we haven't seen this, but, we do know how second stories, if somebody wanted to propose a second story ADU, it would be a ministerial approval, under the current regulations, right?
Yes.
I don't know how common that there would be an attached ADU, but it would be sort of the upstairs would be somebody else's, accessory dwelling unit and living unit. That would not be allowed under this proposal. You'd only be able to do it over the garage, which, we see as a smaller space potentially than a potential second story addition of 1,200 square feet or
Well, I was
950 square feet.
Thinking of if you're going to build a separate detached building, if the main house is single story and it's a single story neighborhood, you don't want someone building a detached ADU that's two-story.
Okay, Margaret, do you have any thoughts about this height?
I feel very strongly it should be 1 story, and the height should be limited, and if it's basically putting it on top of a garage is 2 stories. And I've seen this commission in a personal situation go to 3 stories. So I feel very strongly about height and the way it impacts neighbors, and especially since neighbors aren't, or the staff is proposing that neighbors aren't noticed of what's going on, and they have no neighborhood input as to what's going on, and it's only somebody who doesn't live in that neighborhood that's making the decisions about it. I feel very strongly it should be 1 story. It should be 12 feet high. And if it is above a garage, I think it needs to come under design review.
I don't know if that would be possible. So I would fall in the realm of single story and set a height limit of the 15 feet. I think that's appropriate. And you have 25 feet if constructed above a proposed or existing garage. That makes sense to me.
If it was over the garage, Peter, using your expertise, could it be lower and it still,
Well,
if it was 20 feet or 21?
479 Montecito I'm familiar with, and that's 1611, and
Yeah, so-
it can be.
I'm wondering if we should make it 20 instead of 25. Because there seems to be on what Martha has shown us, there's only one, the one on Grove Avenue,
Well,
that went above 20.
One point of reference is also, if you notice, the whole Robin Drive project, they had their proposed ADUs over the garages, and they were higher than 20, but less than 25. Some others that I think actually 481 Montecito, which is now proposed to be an ADU above the garage, is 22 feet, I believe, 21 or 22 feet.
So my only other topic on this is in general, I feel like the easy picking ADU applications that have been encouraged for the last few years have gone through, right? And so instead of, in a way, I feel like this dialogue is about like, let's explore if there's other safe ways to basically make it so that stock can stay, we can continue to have the ADUs that we need for the next 10 years with this ordinance, right? And if you hamstring them and just, pancake them, you take out a certain amount of ADU applications that we might otherwise get. So that's the other point that I just wanted to bring in. I agree about, I have fear in, say, Madera Gardens, that if they just put a box up on top and no one has any oversight over a garage on all these 1 stories, that it's going to cause issues, right?
Yeah.
And so that I have that fear as well, even though I don't believe that any of our neighborhoods are just 1 stories anymore. Everywhere they've added in, it's a mix. But I understand that one in particular could have the effect, especially with views and stuff like that. And so, but you're not going to be able to have it. And the problem is that the 25 foot doesn't really limit that. You take it down to 20, you're still going to get that. It's just a bigger concern that I have that maybe it's harder to address, but that's, I'm fine with the 25.
I think but I do think it's a good reminder and maybe something we should have prefaced this conversation with a little bit. I think there is sort of the way that we've looked at this, there's sort of a push and a pull, or there's sort of a constraints and then relaxation of other rules. So as you'll see, our recommendations as a whole, there's some requirements that make, reduction in size or the height limitations, but at the same time, we're also considering this lot coverage and potentially allowing to encroach upon a portion of the rear yard. So it's sort of a combination of policies that we think overall, again, aligned with our housing element and the policy direction we've heard from the council in the past, encourages ADUs, but just sort of fine tunes it a little bit more to ensure that there isn't sort of lessons learned. We've seen some things that may have caused some potential issues, but also just anticipating some other aspects of potential ADUs that we want to avoid and looking at other ordinances and whatnot. So it is sort of a package of different proposals that I think the way we've conceived it, and there's room clearly within those, but that sort of on the one hand may limit ADU development to a certain extent, but on the other hand will allow more flexibility. And so that's what it's.
I would propose that staff comes back with one of those lovely slope diagrams and a square footage that shows how the building would possibly be acceptable adjacent to an existing structure, right? And show the 15-foot and say a 22-foot, something like that, for an adjacent building.
Good idea.
And say, this is the demonstrative application of this height requirement.
Okay, you mean on a sloping hill? Is that what you mean, or a flat lot?
You can show it. Well, you can say for the purposes of informational to the applicant. You say here's the flat application, here's the garage application, here's the slope application.
Yeah. Okay.
And just have the three instances. Say this is what could happen with these heights, fellas.
One of the things, and you and I discussed this, Peter, with a home, not an ADU, a while ago, we talk about the height, measuring it from grade, which is what the ordinance says. Well, grade is street level, and we have had several lots that are hills, so they're starting 10 or 15 feet up from grade, and then you're talking about it's 30 feet or 35, whatever it is. I think we have to, it's some way from the, rather than talking about grade as being street level, it's got to be from the foundation or the base of the unit being
Just
built.
like the ordinance calls for height that is parallel with the grade, this would be the same in this case, is that the height would be limited to being parallel with the grade. It doesn't get to extend itself out.
Well, we've seen it happen too often, and that's what I'm concerned
anyway.
about. It's easy to happen when the wording is not precise.
So let's knock this one down unless you have something you got to say.
Just one more, flood. So if this thing gets, you're at 7 foot nav and you got to go up to 12 feet, so you're already adding 5 feet automatically to the foundation. In those special flood consideration zones, that there's some kind of acknowledgement that that's not really building, and that any building would have to do that. So just research it for now. I'm not saying that it had but just so that we understand what those impacts would be.
Yeah, we actually have in our existing ordinance that if the elevation of the existing main house on the site is below the town's base flood elevation, then the floor level of the accessory dwelling unit shall be at least as high as the elevation of the existing main house. So it doesn't speak directly to that, but it does speak to the fact that there should be some accommodation for the floodplain and how to deal with that.
6-foot ceilings. Oh, just
Oh,
kidding.
dear.
Okay, next.
So the next policy amendment is the allowing ADUs within a portion of a rear yard and also possibly increasing lot coverage. So staff has considered allowing a detached ADU to be located in a portion of the required rear yard and increasing the allowable lot coverage. There are many small lots in Corte Madera, and that coupled with a 25-foot rear yard setback makes it nearly impossible to locate a detached ADU on any of these lots. So to facilitate the construction of ADUs on smaller lots, the commission may want to consider allowing a detached ADU in the rear yard. And the zoning ordinance currently allows for an accessory dwelling unit to take up 12% of a rear yard area, and that structure is limited to 10 feet in height, and it needs to maintain 5 feet setbacks from both the rear and the side yard. So this is kind of in a similar vein to that. If this is something the commission would like to explore, staff would recommend having a 10-foot side yard and rear yard setback for a detached ADU in the rear yard. And staff looked at different size lots and evaluated the percentage of how big an ADU could be based on the percentage of the rear yard that could be covered. And the rear yard areas range from 1,500 square feet to 2,000 square feet. And when you're looking at the allowable ADU size, this doesn't take into account the 10 feet setbacks on the rear and the side. So it actually is a smaller size. And this diagram tries to kind of demonstrate it. So this particular parcel has the width of 66 feet. And then if you maintain a 10-foot setback for the side yard and then a 10-foot setback for the rear yard, then your buildable area in the rear yard setback is just over 650 feet. So really that is closer to kind of the 40% coverage. And as staff kind of discussed this and explored it further, if this is something the commission was interested in, we would propose staying closer to the 30%, as 40% or 50% coverage seems too large.
And it also wouldn't preclude, for example, in this example, portion of the structure in the rear yard, but also going into, overlapping, for example, the required rear yard with the rest of the rear yard beyond 25 feet from the rear property line. So it could overlap that way. But I think one of the main things is that in a lot of cases in single-family homes, an attached ADU may not be the preferable way that somebody wants to go. They may be more willing to do an ADU if it's detached, but getting the room and where you locate that is highly constrained. If you basically will go like right in the middle of the yard if you have your normal 25-foot rear yard setback. So it was sort of acknowledging that you may get some smaller some opportunities, again with the height consideration of 15 feet that could go further back into the yard and have a little bit more I guess a sense of privacy between the units than you otherwise would have.
This does not preclude existing structures that are being asked to be ADUs that are non-conforming. So garage has a 1-foot setback on the side and 5 foot on the back.
Correct. That is in current state law, that if there is a garage that's converted to an ADU, that it does not need a setback requirement.
Right, so it's accepted. So that sort of zooms past this problem. And then this is 40% that you've got up there now, or 30%?
So yeah, that would be around 40%.
Okay. So back to your other chart, the last slide.
Yes, so it's this lot right here, the one that has the rear yard area of 1,615 square feet. So if it was 30% rear yard coverage, 484 is the size that would be allowed. And then, the buildable area, when you subtract out the setbacks, is 660 square feet. So that's, just over 40%.
This is a little challenging to my brain, but if you have a standard size lot, 7,500 square foot lot, you've got a 2,400 square foot house on it, then you've got probably, I don't know, maybe 2,000 square foot in the backyard, something like that. So half of the lots in Corte Madera are substandard size, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so they're 4,000 or 5,000 square foot. So that makes a lot of these lots at that point of 1,600 square foot rear yard, just as an average of what you got up there. So there's a lot of properties like that. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with at 30%, you got a large hotel room. At 40%, you have a suite.
Efficiency.
So, I don't. That's the way I think of it, and that the standard to allow this to occur or to encourage it with this chart you've got up there has to accept the fact that there's so many substandard lots. So, Margaret. Okay. Charles.
Yeah, so I was excited about this one because I think this is the one where it'll open up and give a lot more opportunity for people to have their grandmothers come live with them and that type of thing in a lot of the community that otherwise wouldn't. The 25, so 10 foot, I actually wanted to have a dialogue about maybe even being able to reduce that more. Because, so in some conditions, rear yard setbacks and rear yards don't actually butt up to neighbors, right? Like there's other conditions. And for me, side yard and rear yard setbacks have a lot to do with the fire marshal, especially the side setbacks. So when you talk about these non-conforming, in a recent application, I think the fire marshal reviewed and discussed whether it was appropriate to encroach on those. And so, you know, I guess in even if it's administrative, if it could go to the fire marshal and see if they're okay from a safety standpoint with it. But I maybe that's not possible, but I'm just saying, to me, it's more about the appropriate location. Like, what is the rear set? If there's nobody ever going to be there, right? Or if the fire marshal's like, oh, I can't maintain the property, but if it, you know, I'd like to explore that. From what I can see and what I know about all the lots, the 40% and that 600, that sweet spot of 600 to 800 is really the unit, because what I think this will really help with is they come now prepackaged. There's a lot of new startup companies that are basically doing these prepackaged ADU units that they just come in, crane, and drop in, and it reduces the cost and it makes them much more affordable. And it's really at that size that you would start seeing those, and they'd be nice, and you know, it would be somewhere between a large shed, you know, or something in the backyard, high class modern. So I could see that as working, and so that's where I would like to take it and hope that the community could benefit from that type of thing.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I don't think we're precluding, this just shows the portion of the actual required rear yard, that 25-foot setback area by the width of the lot, that could be occupied. So it could overlap, and you could just, it would just place it a little bit closer to get a larger unit. You know what I'm saying? Portion of it, it could be, the back of it could be the 10 feet from the rear, but it could come forward beyond the rectangle.
Yeah.
And sort of get the larger unit if you wanted to go above the 464 square feet or whatever it was.
So, and I want to just talk, you know, this is, we're just having,
discussion.
So I've seen a lot of families that want to go the two-story or whatever. They have considerations about kids, but I feel like there's this whole, you know, who would really want to densify and take away that backyard unit? I mean, ultimately, you should allow a property owner to decide the fate of their properties, right? Like, independent of whether they're, you know, biasing towards families or people with elderly that, you know, need care or whatever, like balancing it out and letting them make the decision. But I guess I really like that because it does open that up, and I feel like it's not available right now, but it is the general direction that I see in the bigger, like, marketplace for wanting to do these and try to grow the market. So I think that this is the place that we could do it and incentivize it or encourage it, like, you know. But, you know, in Madera Gardens, if you stick one of these big buildings in next to all the neighbors, it's, you know, I think about my neighbors and if they did it and what the impacts would be, and it would make it more densified, right? And like, how do we, you know, but that's a broader discussion about the whole community, like all of California, and accepting more people into our communities, right? And so.
Okay, so it is. I want to ask Margaret, did you have any thoughts about this?
Well, I have a question for Charles. It's like, if you weren't noticed that your neighbor was putting up something.
Just to clarify, a neighbor would receive a notice for someone wanting to do a detached ADU.
Okay,
the only
that was
time,
different than what
the
you
only
said.
time that you don't receive a notice is if it's an interior conversion of existing space.
okay.
But if it's a detached structure, everyone would be noticed.
So if you got a notice that someone was just approved because they went through the administrative process and they were putting it up, you had no way to find out the details except to come to town, look at the plan maybe. I don't know if it'll be available. and you had no way to tell whether it was going to impact your view or whatever, how would you feel?
Right. So, number one, I feel like we put fences between all our neighbors in most instances, and that's because we want to define our own privacy and our own rights within it, you know. But that also goes both ways. It means that if we set guidelines as far as being one story and having a minimized impact, that we agree that they could just go ahead and do that. And that's the danger also, but it's also kind of the necessity for all communities to basically deal with the current conditions in California. So, I mean, you know, do I feel comfortable allowing that at Madera Gardens? I wouldn't do it in my own home. I just wouldn't make that decision. But I do know coworkers that are younger. They're 20-something. She's pregnant. Her husband's running the supervisor shop at Tesla, and they can't afford a normal home. Their mom owns a home in another community, and this right here would allow them to basically raise a family. And so I think very particular about those kind of people, and who am I to basically, you know, deny them their mother the ability to do that for them and their growing family. And they've lived here for generations, and you know, I think that's a choice that they have as much choice about the community and the way that it grows as the people surrounding them. And they really need, it's a necessity. Otherwise, they're just going to have to leave, and we'll lose that next generation. And so, you know, that's why I would allow this at 40%. And also, I'd like to talk about the total lot coverage. It is that you need to reduce the amount of lot coverage and allow more building on it. And so.
Okay. All right. So, Margaret, you can think about that for a minute if you want, or do you have a conclusion?
Well, my comment back to Charles is, if that mother is going to move into this shed in the backyard of their kid's home, I hope it's not me.
Right.
I don't want to live in a shed. I don't know any grandmother living anywhere that wants to move into that size, to basically a large suite-size room for the rest of their life.
I think we had community members that
unrealistic
felt
thing.
differently, though. I understand that for yourself. But
I'm just going to say, one, I'm worried about, everybody put sunrooms on the back of their house in the 50s and 60s. You know, this becomes the new sunroom, and anyway, Phyllis.
Okay. The normal setback on a lot, the rear setback is 25 feet, correct?
For the R1 district.
Right.
It's sometimes it's greater if it's a bigger lot.
But that's the average, the usual. So this is lowering the number of feet in that setback to 10?
Correct.
I don't have any problem with that. And, I mean, right now it's 30% is what we...
So right now, we allow
The coverage.
an accessory structure to be located within 12% of a rear yard area. So we're evaluating if an ADU would be located in the rear yard area, what's an appropriate percentage to allow?
Right, but currently it's 12%.
Correct, for an accessory structure.
Yeah, and limited to 10 feet in height.
Okay. Right, now we're talking about allowing 15 feet in height. And, I don't know, 30, somewhere between 30 and 40 I could.
can you restrict window height? Like outside of the height of the overall building, can you restrict window height?
So we are looking to limit windows when it's located within 20 feet of an adjacent structure. And they would be required to be clear story windows unless it's in a bathroom, it would be an obscured window. So we're still working through that standard. So if anyone has, feedback, we would be.
This would be specifically on the side yards. So if on the side yards, we are thinking about how to write some very clear black and white regulations that allow really to ensure that relationship to the sides at least is respected from a privacy
Side
standpoint.
yards are normally 5 feet setback.
5 or 6, yeah.
Yep.
And here you're saying going 10 feet, you're also doing the side yard as 10 feet.
Yes. Again, to allow a little bit more because it's backyard, so it's sort of, it creates a little bit more of an angle of, more setback on the side in the back of the property.
So it ultimately has to be accompanied with some architectural guidelines that keep this from being an infringement upon the neighbors, to your point.
And a box.
It either has to have, can impact we don't want it to impact the sunlight and the shade on the neighbor. At 15 feet, it's not likely to do that unless they've got something within 5 or 10 feet of their backyard as well. So that criteria is windows, height, roof lines, all that thing. 15 feet, they have to decide shed roof, gable roof, whatever it is, they have to figure it out. And again, diagrams will demonstrate to an applicant what is acceptable. Other than that, I would say, I would agree with Phyllis, 35% versus when you're over that 750, right? So is that how it would work?
And we can come back with, I think, this is good guidance. This is the type of thing that's helpful, but we can come back with, I think, some better diagrams and more examples of how this would work elsewhere as well.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of, like, where they stamp them out, and you can really see the impacts of different variables.
Yeah. So Phyllis has requested a break here, so
Yes.
we take a,
My legs are
literally a
going.
short break because we've got some territory to cover. So we'll take a break and be back here.
Thank you.
No later than 9:10. Thank you.
Yeah, you too.
We're going to pick up where we left off here, and Martha's got the parking space.
So this is
Slide.
the last category in the policy amendment section, and then it should start to move a little bit faster. So this is evaluating location of parking spaces, and there's parking spaces, kind of two different categories: parking space when it's required for an ADU, and then a parking space when it's required if a garage is converted or demolished to make way for an ADU. So the town's current ordinance allows for a required ADU parking space to be located in the front setback between the driveway and the closest side of the property. So this picture on the bottom kind of shows that scenario where you have a two-car garage and then the driveway, and then off in the kind of the side yard area is a parking space where someone has parked. So the current ordinance does allow, if an ADU parking space is required, for that space to be located in that portion of the lot. One thing that we're asking you to consider is if the ordinance should be amended to allow the ADU parking space to be located on the existing driveway in the front setback. So that's kind of the first piece of it. The second piece is looking at when a garage is converted to an ADU, and the way the current code reads is those parking spaces need to be replaced. And should the replacement parking spaces be allowed to occur on the existing driveway, or alternatively also in the side yard area in between the driveway and the closest side property? So those are the two questions, and parking is often seen as one of the major barriers to ADUs. So staff has been evaluating different ways where we could eliminate this barrier, as a way to kind of remove the parking barrier. So having some additional flexibility on where that parking space is required or allowed to be.
Could you go back to the previous slide, please?
Yeah, and I just want to add real quickly, the slide here. So just so we can all be on the same page. So the front setback area is usually 15 or 20 feet from the front property line back, off the property line. And so oftentimes driveways are entirely within the front yard. We've seen a lot of actually, especially in the flat areas with one-car garages, we've seen variances when people add on that we allow for the second parking space to be uncovered in the front yard setback. That currently requires a variance for any parking, whether it's for the primary house or an ADU, unless the ADU, we have this one rule that allows it to be within the driveway and the closest side property line, so you could do that for ADUs. But oftentimes we see, as I'm sure you're all aware, parking is, people park on their driveways in front of their garages. And so I think this is something that for ADUs would not be impactful from a character standpoint because it occurs already today with great frequency around many of our neighborhoods, but would actually be a significant, provides significant relief, I think, to applicants who are seeking to do it, because otherwise they have to go through a variance process, which is time and money and uncertainty regarding whether or not you could actually do it. Or find another location that would comply, which would be outside of the setback areas. So somehow, some are able to do it, but quite frequently it's this situation that you're looking at in front of you here.
So the fact is that this is really a permitting issue when you look at the project on plan. In practice, there's zero enforcement ability for this.
Well, I'll speak just from the 5 year. It is. I think that may be taken a little bit extreme, but yeah, no. It's currently the variance is an obstacle, whether it's for ADUs or for others. But we have this rule in place. It's been in place for many years. That required parking should not be located or cannot be located in the front setback. Front yard, which is equivalent to the front setback area. So we've permitted it again in many instances through variance, but it is not allowed. So when we talk to people at the public counter and downstairs, we let folks know that they can't do that without a variance, and it means some of them choose to go ahead, and others do not. So we've seen several examples recently, I think, actually, of where this has come up for people who've wanted to do ADUs. We see it all the time for people who are doing additions to their home that only have one space currently for their primary home, and they need to put another parking space on their lot, and they oftentimes seek the variance for this as well. So.
Okay, so you've got practical situation here that skates by in many cases in terms of.
Oh, actually, where people actually practically park. All right, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, people will leave their cars on their driveways. I think many of us do.
You can't enforce people to not turn their garages into storage units.
Yeah, I was thinking
or workout rooms. So. Okay.
We have, in specific projects, we do have put stuff into HOA requirements that we'll be looking at that. But no, in general, that is not something that has been actively enforced.
All right, Phyllis, you.
Yeah, the only thing to take into consideration is if it's my house and my garage that I'm using, and there's a car parked in the driveway, and it's blocking me getting my own car out of the garage because one of my kids, there was a time when we had 5 cars at our house with a 2-car garage, but there was a turnaround and there were 3 cars. We just weren't able to turn around.
Okay.
But I'm saying, if it's your own and there's a car parked, then you go in and you say, move the car. That's why it's practical to have it to the side as the bottom photograph you're seeing. If there's somebody who's renting the space and puts their car there in the driveway, and that person took the bus to work or got picked up and driven somewhere, and you've got to get your car out of the garage, and that person isn't there to move his or her car, you've got a problem.
That's the owner-occupied problem.
Well, even in the city, I did run into that, and we had a spare key in the garage.
Let's not worry about that here. So the question is...
I would leave it the way it is.
Okay. So, Charles?
I hate parking, and I would eliminate it from all planning stuff. And I see it as such a hindrance to developing a better world to basically accommodate the car culture of bygone era. So I just really would like to open it up to allow any possibility for variance into the front and stuff. I mean, in my own community, there's a lot of those variances, and I don't think that they're a detriment to the urban fabric there. And so encouraging it and allowing breaking down those barriers to take it to the next level of ADU applications, I think is a good thing. And I don't see it as being really dangerous to safety or anything else. But That's
Okay.
me.
Well, that's good. You're going to propose the Lime scooter ordinance for the town as well. Just kidding. So, Margaret.
I agree that I think it should be done by variance, which should be left the way it is, and anybody who wants an exception should go through some kind of review process and ask for that exception and be aware of the fact that they're getting the exception and not to take advantage of it. I don't know. Does this discussion of the parking also take into discussion of whether or not they need a parking space, like the public transportation issue?
That's a different issue, and it's
Okay.
2 slides away.
Okay.
So just to follow, so I've heard a lot from the community about the fear about these with the parking of them coming out in the street, right? And so the number one way to avoid that is to allow them to park the cars in different configurations on the property, right? And so it'll at least give them the option to alleviate that more, and thus dealing with what I see as a big complaint about the public perception of them. And yet we want to deny that and make it more difficult so that, we hear more complaints from the public. It's just my 2 cents on it, but I just feel like this is to keep them off the street, so.
All right, so let me ask this, that the idea of allowing, from a planner viewpoint, to just get rid of this requirement, what does that do willy-nilly for parking, historically? Do you guys look at it as an encouragement or a discouragement, or what is the end result of,
So
getting rid of parking requirements and just letting?
I think it could encourage the creation of more ADUs in the community. The parking is, I think, one of the main barriers to ADUs, and oftentimes when people hear that, if they demolish their garage, now they have to replace the parking spaces and they have to go through a variance process, that does, scare people away oftentimes. People don't want to take the risk and spend the money to go through that type of process. I think if you eliminate the parking requirement, then, people park either on driveways or, potentially on the adjacent streets as well.
Right, so there is no good, there's no known outcome of doing this, frankly, for removing that restriction. It just allows other than the fact that more ADUs will be permitted, more than likely.
Right. I mean, the only other outcome would just be that you will, people will, I guess, park in the front yard. I mean, but they do as well today. I mean, there may be a slight increase in the, and I'm saying front yard where I mean the existing driveway in the sort of in front of the garage. But that would be a permitted place to park. So I don't know what other.
I see most people parking in the front of their houses, regardless whether they need it or not. They
I mean,
don't-
I think.
Street?
No.
So I think on the one hand,
Not in the garage.
I think it may be as simple as just saying, on the one hand, if you allow required ADU parking to go into the driveway, you may get more ADUs, and if you don't, you may get less. And therefore, it's, there's more you'll get maybe more cars with one, and you'll get less cars with the other.
Can I elaborate a little bit with how
Sure.
I interpret that? So if I pay an architect or do the ability to put together a plan for it, and it's an administrative review, and I know that the parking, if I do it a certain way, it's approved, I'm much more apt to turn in that application. If it is that I go and spend all the money to put together the application, but it's dependent on a variance that may or may not go through, it's the same thing that we're having a discussion with the hotel. If we incentivize and make it clear what the expectations are, you're going to get more acceptance and more proposals than if it's discretionary, right? Or in some way unknown, right? And so I guess that's ultimately why it would lead to more. But
So there's not many cautionary tales about getting rid of this requirement, other than that more people may bring cars. We don't know that. If we take it away, then we will have an increase in ADUs, no doubt about it.
And to point out, one of the bills being considered by the legislature, if it's adopted in its current form, it would circumvent a jurisdiction from requiring the replacement parking spaces at all. So if you did convert your garage, you would not need to replace those parking spaces if this bill is adopted.
Right.
Coming down the pike.
And I think we were also, one of the things, just to, again, you asked what unanticipated things. So we also thought we would require them to be uncovered spaces, so that you're not putting some sort of carport or something in your front yard or anything like that. So it'd have to just be an uncovered space, but that would be allowed. And I think just to go back to make sure it's clear, there's two aspects of it. One is the required parking for an ADU, which is a maximum of one space under state law. And again, we can get into this in the second one. Public transit would not be required parking isn't required for ADUs within a half mile of a public transit stop. But if one is required, it would be maximum of one. And then there is the sort of the conversion of a garage as well requirement, which we do currently require that you replace the two spaces for most single-family homes. Unless you're over 4,000 square feet home, then you have 3. But if there's 2, those have to be replaced as well on the property. But state law says those can be in any configuration, tandem or whatnot, but we have the ability to say they can't be in the front yard, and we also think that should be allowed to be sort of moved into the,
Okay.
those could be uncovered and in the front yard.
Well, I would agree with that. So Phyllis, if you have a quick comment
Yeah,
before we move on.
actually a question. If you have to have, you're building a house, you have to have 2 spaces, and I think it's one has to be covered? That's right. You convert the garage into an ADU. You still have to have 2 spaces for the house itself. Well, if the garage is no longer a garage, it's now an ADU, there should be no reason why cars could not be parked on what before had been the driveway. It's the idea when the garage continues to be a garage and you're putting the car there blocking, people getting the car in and out of the garage. There's a difference.
Okay.
I'd add one more question about the parking requirements. So currently, our space size that's required is 18 foot by 9 foot. Is that correct for a parking spot? Because I've talked to designers that are currently doing designs in the city, right? And they drive smart cars, and so there's actually a much smaller reduction in the size of the car, right? We don't have to accommodate Chevy Suburbans in both locations, and the ADU itself is a micro dwelling, right? And people are driving compact cars. So another way we could also look at is can you reduce for the ADUs the size requirement for the car and just park a smaller car, like a compact car space?
You can't force somebody to buy a car.
Well, no, I mean, that's just a planning criteria. Like, what do you say a good-sized car
Our
spot
space,
is, right?
so our regulations we actually only have space requirement, the actual size requirements for commercial lots, which is 20 by 9. Compacts are 18 by 8.5. We generally use somewhere in between there for a residential space, or when we're saying whether or not, for example, a garage is a 2-car garage or 1-car garage, we'll use those dimensions. So that's generally what you use, but we actually don't have an actual code requirement for a residential size space.
I think that becomes another administrative regulation that we don't want to, that's my thought, administer. So,
Can you ban suburban mothers from driving vans when they have 2 kids?
Because there was a public comment about those spaces going out over into the sidewalk and the public right away, that would not be permitted. So the spaces have to be entirely within someone's property.
okay, otherwise they block the sidewalk, or if there is a sidewalk, right? Okay, enough said. Parking. Let's move to
Do we have to take that vote?
It's not at 9:30, it's at 10, isn't it?
No, I think. What, do we have to take the vote? What?
It's 10
Of
p.m.
what?
There's a plan to adjourn all meetings by 10 unless the commission votes to extend the
Okay.
meeting.
Yeah, it's 10 o'clock.
Number 5, procedural note.
Okay.
Okay, now we're getting to my favorite subject, right?
Yep. So this is changes to clarify existing regulations, and staff is proposing some new definitions be placed in the ordinance, which includes accessory dwelling unit attached, accessory dwelling unit detached, accessory dwelling unit interior, efficiency kitchen, existing structure, and public transit. And this is just to provide additional clarity. And I'll spend a little bit more time on public transit on the next slide. So does anyone have any comments on any of the proposed definitions?
It's a good breakdown.
Okay.
Margaret?
No, not.
Yeah. Other than.
Okay. Phyllis?
Now we're my favorite subject, public transit.
Right.
Are you in support of those new definitions?
Except for public transit.
All right. So here
Oh,
we
I
are.
did have one question about the and under the general requirements and the word ownership.
Where's that?
It's not in there.
Is that part of
You
it?
have to go back one?
Yeah, so that's not one of the definitions,
Oh,
but
okay, I'm
it is
sorry.
listed, I believe, talking about owner occupancy. I believe
Yeah,
that's where the
yeah.
ownership.
Okay, I can save it.
Okay, so state law precludes a jurisdiction from acquiring a parking space for an ADU if it's located within a half mile of public transit. And our current ordinance does not define how to measure that half mile, whether it's a radius or as the crow flies or a walking distance. So one of the changes staff is proposing to clarify that is that it is a traversable distance, which would be the distance someone would either walk or drive along, designated right of way. The next change staff is proposing is to define public transit to include transit routes 113 and 117. So the definition being proposed is a location including but not limited to a bus stop or train station where the public may access buses, trains, and other forms of transportation that charge set fares, run on fixed routes, and are available to the public. Public transit may include commuter and school bus stops. School bus routes provided by a school district for the exclusive use of students shall not be considered public transit.
I would like to further define what the public transit school buses are, because I don't think most people realize it. These are run just like the private school districts. Yes, they stop at regular bus stops, but they run only in the hours when school is in session. They run in the morning when the students are going to school. They run in the afternoon to bring them home. That's when they run. If it is a short day because of teachers' conferences, instead of that bus running at 3 o'clock to bring the students home, it's running at 12 noon. It does not run when school is not in session, be it a holiday, be it the summer, be it a teacher, God, my kids, it's been so long since I had kids in school, teacher training day, or whatever. The only difference is if there is room on that bus, and remember, if there is room, because this is for students going to a specific school or schools, if there are a couple of extra seats, a member of the public can, quote unquote, hitch a ride by paying a fare. This is not regular public transportation. It is not taking you to the ferry terminal. It is not taking you to San Francisco. It is not taking you to other places. This is not public transit. It is very questionable under federal law, and state law has not defined it. I have been in touch trying to get a written opinion that states this. You cannot say that a school bus that'll let you on if there's an extra seat is public transit. This is a way that we that should not be used to allow people not to have a parking space if there is not public transit within X amount of miles or half mile, whatever the rest of the wording is. And I think it's about time we stopped playing. We had the one place go through. I'm sure they'll be grandfathered in no matter what. I think you should leave it alone until we get an answer from the state. And not make this change now, because I don't want to see any more go through. I will tell you right now, I will vote against the changes when it comes to this, and I will vote against any ADU that is using this escape from having to provide a parking space, because it'll only end up in the street.
Phyllis, but what if they come back and say that legal definition is that it is a
Well,
buffer?
let's not
vote against it.
Hang on a second.
Okay,
Let
I
me
just
let
want
Adam speak here.
I think that's fine. I think the key thing was that we have the ability to define it however, we want to define it. So obviously there are certain parameters within that, but if there's a discussion that, you do not want to include those, and I heard that very clearly, so I think that was an opinion. That's up for discussion. That's why we're bringing it to the commission. That's why we have prepared a couple of maps here that show the different routes and the radiuses from there that show approximate where.
And who gives you the ability to define
Wait a
it?
sec.
Where
The
do we
state,
have this?
the state.
So
I didn't see anything in the state code.
So just for
either.
clarification, in the ADU legislation, there is nothing that requires the town to define public transit in this manner. However, in discussions with HCD, since it was not defined in their legislation and they've not set the standards, it goes back to that local control is in the ADU legislative scheme is that where you can't be more restrictive than state law for the ADUs, but those jurisdictions that want to be more permissive, the state has given local control to being more permissive, be more generous. It's sort of like the discussion of the parking. Do you allow parking in setbacks? Do you allow, reduced setbacks and things? And if you look at the state legislation and you talk to HCD, they would love jurisdictions to be more permissive and less restrictive on this. But be very clear for all the Planning Commission and the public. You are absolutely correct. There's nothing in state law that requires or suggests that public transit should be defined this way. It is just staff brought it to you in 2017 this way, and staff is bringing it back to you, and they're making a suggestion that and again, just for education and background for everyone, it's up for a discussion, and I think Adam probably has some
And
additional.
I asked at the time it came up originally for staff to go to the state, and things happened, and it never took place. I think it's about time we got an answer from the state. Anybody, and as I say, it doesn't even meet
we have.
federal
Phyllis,
requirements.
Let me just ask this. So the state does not allow us to define it and say we can make a restriction based on our definition of public transit?
No, they do. We can, for the state, for example, was silent on what a half a mile means. So we're defining that, that it's a traversable distance, right?
So it comes down to whether or not we want to define it.
Right.
And
other jurisdictions have talked about public transit meaning a certain amount of headway between buses. That is what public transit means, that it's every 15 minutes it has to stop at a bus stop, so on and so forth. I imagine ultimately this will play out in probably some legal challenge that we've talked to HCD about it. They recognize that it's sort of ambiguous, and you'll see that there's new legislation that's being proposed that actually is trying to clarify exactly what they mean by this legislation. So it's not worth really debating sort of how vague and how unclear the state legislation wrote this. We have to deal with it, and I think we have some flexibility in how we deal with it within our community because it was written in a way that is somewhat vague.
Well, since there's legislation that they're talking about that will better define these things, I think you ought to just leave everything alone until you get an answer.
Well, even leaving it alone, we're going to be faced with the question of how to administer the current state law.
So, wait a
And
second,
I
let me just ask
know
a
each
question
one
here.
of them that
Phyllis, hold on a
uses
second.
it.
I want to we're going to be here going around about this. I just want to ask each of you guys, do you want to define what public transit is? Margaret?
I want to define it as being a year-round opportunity for the
So you do
public
wanna
to
define it.
traverse a half a mile.
Charles, do you want to define
Year-round.
it? Or do you want to just leave
Well,
it
so
alone?
I don't think we're going to define it collectively. I think we're going to argue
Just-
about our
I just want
points.
to ask, do you want to define it or not?
So we can have a dialogue, but I don't think we're going to define it tonight.
Well, I'm asking, do you want to define it?
Yeah, and I want to. Yeah,
Good.
fine.
First step, want to define it. So that means that we're going to put some criteria on what is public transit.
Right. And
Peter, why don't you just ask whether or not they want to include
I think
That's my
school
next
buses as
So,
public transit? That's a lot easier.
if I may also,
hang on a sec, let Adam finish.
part of this may, I mean, look, this is ultimately about whether a parking space is required or not, right?
Right.
So part of this you may want to look to our discussion that we just had about allowing parking in the front setback as well. I mean, that if somebody is allowed then to have a required accessory dwelling unit parking space in their front yard setback, that will still be required an ADU space. You may want to define this so that it's year round or what have you. Doesn't include the school bus routes, 113, 117, but they now have a ability to provide a parking space in a much more flexible way than previously. So there's potentially some ways to look at this in combination. I think staff feels that if you do neither of those, again, it's a pretty significant barrier to encouraging the development of ADUs, because you're going to be, for a significant part of the east side of Corte Madera, there's going to be a requirement for an ADU parking space, and not, in a lot of those subdivisions, are not a lot of locations where they could put it without being in the front setback. So
I
that's
could
steps.
go along with that.
Okay, so the next step is the current definition did include those part-time buses. Would you include those or not? And the question is,
So I guess I'm feeling pigeonholed into answering this question to make the overall decision, and I really want to step back and have a discussion about the overall definition of what public transit is, not the thing that was related to the last issue that was a pain in the butt, right? Like, so.
why would that be different? That's the
Be-
one.
be- bec- Because I want to know why the bus stop itself isn't considered access to public transit, whether they're currently operating or not, because they're canceling a bunch in San Anselmo, and if you make it based on current trajectories of public transit, as long as the facility is there to enable it, you have public transit. So tomorrow they decide that there's enough ridership that's coming out of the K that they put a bus line through it. And basically restricting and hamstringing the whole east side of Corte Madera based on current routes, when the routes change continuously, does not seem like the right dialogue we should have about what public transit is. So I want to take a step back if I'm going to define it and say it's the bus stop itself and the availability for us to do public transit now and in the future, whether it's running or not. And that's all I have to say. And then you guys can say whatever, but that's just really how I would define it or want to have the dialogue, is that public transit is not a transient thing.
Well,
that,
it's nowhere near a reality to be out there. So, to say that that there's public transit out there would be a misnomer. It's just a fact. They don't have it, and there's no plans for it in the near future. So, Margaret.
Under the law, you have to, the one thing they do consider is the totality of the circumstances. And if you look at what the situation is now, which is another requirement of the law, you can only look at what is now and happening now. Right now, it's not available on July 10th to the general public. I'm the general public, say I want to go to the 4th of July parade. I can't find public transportation within a half mile walk of my house to get across the highway. That's not public transportation.
Right.
And so I think by the law, you can't accept that those two routes meet the definition.
I would agree. It doesn't exist yet, can't be allocated as a definition if it doesn't exist. So with that said,
Okay.
that's where it stands right now, I think.
Touched upon this a little bit earlier in the evening. Staff is proposing changes to clarify what an existing structure is in Christmas Tree Hill. So as we've discussed, there are limits on the number of ADUs that can be located in Christmas Tree Hill. And state law makes a big distinction between an ADU within an existing structure and an ADU that's a new detached structure or in addition to the existing house. So per state law, ADUs located in single-family residential zones in existing spaces of single-family residence or accessory structure must be approved regardless of zoning standards for ADUs, including locational requirements. So there could be a situation where someone comes in to apply for an ADU within Christmas Tree Hill, and that particular zone already has the maximum number of allowed ADUs. So instead, they decide to do either an accessory structure, such as a pool house, or to do an addition to the house, and then later come in and want to convert that space to an ADU. So under our current ordinance, there's nothing in place that would enable staff to say, no, you cannot create that ADU from the existing place because it's precluded by state law. So staff is proposing to update the definition to require that a structure has been in existence for at least 5 years before it can be converted to an ADU. Are there any comments or concerns?
How
with
did
that?
you come to 5 years?
Judith asked the same question.
Yeah.
But they had an answer, Phil.
There's a couple of things. I would say one place we looked, so currently to try to get around sort of incremental things in the floodplain or incremental development, there's a 5-year rule where, for example, you add up all the improvements within a 5-year period in the floodplain, and if all those improvements in the 5-year period exceed 50% of the value of the structure, then you got to raise your house. So that's one area. The idea is that it's enough time where somebody isn't going to purposely expose a loophole through development or through sort of basically building something they don't really want to build. Or in the case of the floodplain, doing something in increments over a 5-year period of time. You're going to have to live with that for 5 years. You're not getting the product you really want just to get around not having to raise your house. Similarly, I think we feel that 5 years is that reasonable amount of time whereby somebody isn't purposely going to build something that they don't want. They actually want an ADU. They're not going to build an addition that they don't want. And then 5 years later, just for the purposes of getting around the regulation, and 5 years later saying, all right, well, now I finally get what I originally wanted in the first place, and it's been 5 years. That's, it can be a different time period. But we think that's a reasonable amount of time that was sort of just arrived at based on some other standards we looked at in the building code and whatnot.
Phyllis,
Yeah, I would suggest, due to past experience, since there is that Christmas Tree Hill group, I forget what the title is, the
Sure.
the advisory group or
Yes.
something, that before we
Hill
have
Dwellers
any
Association.
discussion, you make sure that they take a look at it,
Absolutely.
or we'll have this room filled to capacity.
Absolutely. It's a good suggestion.
All right. So does this mean anything to you, Margaret? That you have a
I
comment?
think it's probably a good idea to put
Right.
that in.
Charles?
Yeah, I read it. It makes sense. I understand the 5-year. I think that's a nice, like, where you live with it and you really have to be calculated as like a long-term resident to make any choices based on that. And so it's really about the overall longevity of how you want to live your life in the property. Anything less than that, you could still be a transient, like, property developer, right? So,
I think that was the concern, that somebody could say, I'm going to build this house, and within a year, I'm going to build an ADU,
Right, yeah, so I like that five years is far enough out but it doesn't ultimately restrict a long-term resident from morphing based on family conditions or whatever that
Yeah, I
might
mean,
come up.
I like it, I just think it should go to that group, whatever it's called, and
I
get
think
their
that's a good
input.
suggestion as well.
Great, okay.
Okay, so in the current ordinance, there's a requirement that an ADU not be rented out for less than 30 days. And the intent of the town's ADU ordinance is to facilitate the creation of affordable infill housing. So obviously, we do not want to have a situation where ADUs are rented out for short term. So this is a current requirement in the ordinance, and staff is recommending that it be included as part of the deed restriction, and this would ensure that a future buyer was aware of this limitation.
Okay, I think we're all sort of
Agreement?
like thumbs up.
Actually, just to share my opinion, I actually don't like putting it as a deed restriction, because ultimately, I feel like that's once again just putting an assignment on it. I think that and I had a question here about it. The 30-day rental ordinance is bigger. It's about not allowing Airbnbs into the community and stuff. So there's a whole nother set of laws that dictates that the council and everybody else is making for the overall, for everyone. And if they, in the future, for some reason, we need to change that, but these people, like, I personally would just allow it to be on the council and the community to make that decision for all the property stock when that time comes, if they want to revert from that, which is already in place somewhere else. Like, that's.
Can I comment on that?
Yes.
Or do you want to?
I just wanted to ask before you comment, because you might encompass it. Could it be part of, like, when we do an approval here and we go through the resolution, there are a whole bunch of things that are added onto it, to the fire and all those type of things. I'm sure when you do it administratively, you've got that list of things.
Oh, yeah,
Or when the building permit is issued, there are a whole bunch of things that are attached to it. Couldn't that restriction be part of that rather than on the deed itself?
It already is, yeah, it is.
Then
It would
is it
be.
necessary to put it on the deed?
Well, if I would just like to comment a little bit. I think one of the things that concerns me about not really enforcing this is that we are, if you go back to the specific purpose of this ordinance and state laws and everything that's going into the state laws, there's a lot of relaxation of normal regulations to try to encourage this as a housing resource. It's really a housing production type of regulation, a regulatory framework that's been created for us. It's in our policies that this is housing, this isn't Airbnb. So I would be concerned that if rules come out in the future that allow for somebody to rent Airbnb throughout town and some of their, a certain number of days per year or what have you, whatever it is, that this ultimately people are taking advantage of specific regulations that were there to provide for housing and then renting it out and or turning it into an Airbnb or something else.
So, but is there a way to encapsulate, so that.
And the only
thing
way to
is when
really.
it's deed specific versus an ordinance that you could basically revert if the council wanted to.
It is in the well, it's already in the ADU ordinance, so it is a requirement of the ordinance. I think we wanted to elevate it, I think, to make it abundantly clear. It's in the same way that the owner occupancy requirement is a deed restriction. I mean, it could be.
But we're going to look into that, right? And whether that goes.
Absolutely.
This is specific to the ADUs.
Well, I'm not. Yeah, I think it's a valid comment. We don't necessarily have to have it.
I think it could be addressed other than in the deed. As they say, when giving the approval, it's something that says it is understood because of the relaxation of certain restrictions, this will happen. It's there, and it's, as I say, with the building permit, once again, and I guess people sign off to get it, that it's understood.
I think that
So-
unless it's explicitly stated that it gets lost from owner to owner to owner, they
I
don't
agree.
care. It has to stay as a covenant of the property.
So just let me just talk about a little bit about state law, kind of from a neutral standpoint, just so that you understand. One of the things that isn't, it's always been in the ADU legislation, and it's not contemplated, is it allows the local agency to do these deed restrictions for this provision, to prohibit rentals of less than 30 days. And as Peter indicated, the challenge with, it can be an all, and the Planning Commission knows this better than anyone. You know, you put requirements on all sorts of properties, and if it's not part of a deed restriction and that property passes and transfers ownership, there is absolutely no legal record. And while the town can start an enforcement action, which is, you know, costly and timely and whatnot. And, you know, certainly one of the things that town of Corte Madera, like most communities, don't really want to be adverse to their own community members and things like that. So all a deed restriction does is really put it on notice to the subsequent owners of a property that if you're going to buy this property, that you understand that this is for a, somebody can use the ADU for their own use, or they can rent it, or they can put a family member in it. And they don't have to rent it. It doesn't deed restrict it for that. But it puts a buyer on notice that they can't rent it as a short-term rental. That's the only reason why staff's recommending that. And that goes back to the purpose of what you and council indicated, that you wanted these for residents.
Yeah. So my only statement to that is, you know, we're really trying to talk about how we get more ADUs, or listening to the public about, you know, ways that they would want to come and make applications. And one of the main things I heard from the community today is that deed restrictions are definitely not something they want to see, and definitely something that would make them more skeptical about doing the ADUs. So I just want to remind everybody about that while we make this decision, especially if we're protected in other ways through other laws right now.
Well, we're not. And the thing is that I don't see that this requirement, it actually ensures that people can say, I've got an ADU, and my neighbor's ADU and the other neighbor's ADU are all going to be used for housing, right? They're not going to be turned into hotel rooms. And I just think that it's not an impediment. It's to people doing the ADUs. It just says this is what it's going to be used for. It's housing. It's not for a hotel room.
If people object to rental units, they're sure going to object to these short-term rentals, because that's when the damage is done and all sorts of things go on.
I fought this battle 40 years ago in another town in another state, and it was short-term rentals that were not housing. And people turning them over to short-term rentals was a huge problem.
Yeah, that's the
and
point.
so they had to engage owners in the same way that we're proposed to doing it now. And it was their only solution to stopping the trend toward short-term rentals.
Yeah, I mean, there is a big difference between somebody renting something to live in, and something rented for a weekend or a week or whatever.
Conversely, how much more do we have here?
Probably about 6 more, I guess. But they're shorter. This is more up.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will make a motion that we move to continue to 10:30.
Okay.
Second.
Voice vote, yay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
So then the next proposed change is to establish a process by which an individual would appeal the decision made by the zoning administrator, either to approve or to deny the decision. So currently, according to government code, the application shall be considered ministerially without discretionary review or a hearing. So the proposed ordinance amendment modifies the review process, and we're trying to create a kind of more functional process than what currently exists in the current ordinance. And the staff is recommending that if someone would like to, could request that the decision be reviewed, they would have 7 days to request the review, and the review would be conducted by the town manager, and the decision of the town manager would be final, and then the fee to request such a review would be a flat fee of $300.
We'll let you know if Todd is okay with this at the next meeting.
This one. May I ask
No.
for a clarification, please?
Okay.
The appeal, is this limited only to the applicant or to any member of the community?
It could be any member of the community.
I think it should show that.
Remember,
in the
this is
wording.
only for the detached right?
Correct.
Or
So
they
this is only for if it's a new detached structure or an addition to an ADU that's added.
And that's because if it's within the existing structure, it goes straight to, the state law says straight to the building permit.
I think somewhere the wording should show that this is not just limited to the applicant, so
Yes.
I think that's important.
And these would all still have the notice so that people know that there's an application, that they have this process available to them.
And does that mean those who pay a couple of $1,000s for the appeals before are going to get some of their money back?
No, this is not, this current ordinance is the current ordinance.
Margaret, you have...
And I would like to, one other thing, just, we've been using appeals, and we should just try to refrain from saying it's an appeal, because it's technically not. Appeal is a discretionary review, so.
Review. Ms. Bandel.
So my question is, if something is approved by staff, and it's going to go to the town manager, how would someone who's been noticed, I've been noticed that this is up for grabs or going to be approved, would I be noticed it was approved and now it's going to the town manager? I mean, how would I
Choose the
know these
option.
things are happening, this thing is moving along?
Typically what happens, so during the noticing period, we typically hear from whoever is concerned about it and has questions about it. And then absolutely we notice anybody who has concerns about it, that there is a decision to be made, and they would be informed. And then that's when the number of calendar days would start. If there isn't another notice on the date other than of actual approval, that is not something that we currently do, and it's not. It would have to be a separate process that we would have to write into our code to require that.
I didn't understand what you just said.
Sorry. So we don't have a separate requirement that there is another notice at the time of approval.
Okay.
That additional notices go out. That's not only not only what we're proposing here, but for all staff level reviews. So generally, and like I said, what happens is we haven't had any issues with it, because we will hear from people when the notice goes out, and then staff always informs the people or the individuals with concerns that a decision will be made or has been made on this date, and they get the actual approval letter or what have you to be able to then file for, in this case, an administrative review.
So I would suggest that the process be made clear in whatever you write up.
Okay.
And clear to the point of being exhaustively clear.
Okay.
Because it's a matter of due process.
Yeah.
Phyllis?
Yeah, I'm concerned about having it go to Todd, though I think he's excellent at doing things, because of a problem I saw in the past when I was an elected official on the college board. When an appeal came and we listened to what the board listened to what the president had to say, the complaint came back, well, of course you're going to back the staff. How is Todd going to collect his information so you are not put in the position as the planning director of feeding him information that he is dealing in a neutral way?
Right. Well, and I think this works primarily because we're changing, we're moving to a very clear objective review of the record. There is no more, I know we've had conversations in the past about what our prior code said regarding privacy and views and things like that, that was in the ordinance. So we want to move, and I think this only works if we move to a code that is very clear with no subjectivity about how to administer the ordinance. And that's why I also think we're able to, to reduce the fee to what it is, because it should just be literally, here's the standards, here's the code, does it meet the technical requirements of the ordinance, and was that applied properly?
So what would go to the town manager is what was contemplated when staff discussed this was it would be all written documents submitted to the town at the time of the request. So staff would turn over its entire file and its process of review. Whoever is requesting this review, either a single member of the public or a group member of the public at the time, has to submit what their arguments are and any documents, photos, whatever. And basically, it's a review of the record. So you don't have staff there trying to influence Todd.
Okay.
You don't have the member of the public there. Anybody has had a chance to submit the documentation of it. Remember, there's no hearing, there's no, recordings, because these are administrative, ministerial permit reviews. So what you've got is the manager independently reviewing the record. Anything submitted by the public who's challenging this, anything submitted by staff, the entire file. So you don't have that kind of, we hear what you're saying, that you still have the town managers supervising the decision maker, the underlying. The other thought is that, the town can, one of the options, certainly the town could look at having an independent hearing officer, and then the cost is going to be more because the town has to do cost recovery of an independent hearing officer, and that's going to be likely somebody that's charging several $100s per hour to review the record and write a decision. So, again, not saying that can't happen, but that certainly was a concern because we heard everybody issue comments about
No,
cost.
I think it's fine the way it is. As long as Todd can say he came at it in the neutral position without being influenced, and that's to protect him, that's to protect the planning department, Adam as the planning director.
Yeah, and I think we will explore and see what other models may be out there and come back with one we think is the best. But as of now, this is sort of where we are.
Keep costs down.
And keep, absolutely.
Yeah, we'll tell Todd you.
What? Todd doesn't know this yet.
I know.
Well,
okay.
The council better give him a raise.
Consistent with prior approvals.
Okay, the next change is to ensure consistency with prior approvals. So staff is proposing language to require that ADU not conflict with any other land use entitlements that were previously granted. So you could have a situation where a design review was approved, and as part of that, landscaping was required to be planted to protect privacy of the adjacent residents. So the homeowner couldn't come in and apply for an ADU permit, and as part of that, take out that landscaping that was needed to make the findings for the design review. So this is essentially just kind of requiring that the ADU not conflict with any prior entitlements, and also the applicant would have the opportunity to amend the prior entitlement and then apply for the ADU permit.
And so this is consistent, frankly, with current practice, but we want to be explicit about it in the code so that people have an understanding before they apply that they're going to need to be aware of any existing requirements that may be on their property that were associated with a prior entitlement.
Any thoughts or issues with this paragraph, anybody?
It's for all its major and minor design reviews.
Mm-hmm. Any entitlement.
Yeah, it seems fair.
Yeah. Margaret?
It seems like the right thing to do.
It seems the right thing to do. Okay.
Okay, the next change is to establish a kind of two processes depending on if the ADU is within an existing structure or if it is a detached or an attached ADU. So the town's current ordinance requires that all applicants, even those within an existing structure, obtain an ADU permit, and the planning fee is $850, and then there is courtesy noticing to all individuals within 300 feet. And per government code, the government code requires that an agency ministerially approve an application for a building permit when the ADU is located within an existing structure. So again, state code really distinguishes between when an ADU is in an existing structure versus when it's a new detached or attached structure. So staff is proposing two different processes. The first would be a detached or attached ADU, and for this, it would continue to follow what the current ordinance requires, the $850 fee and the courtesy noticing. And then the second would be if it's an interior ADU or a junior ADU, and in those cases, the applicant would apply straight to a building permit.
I don't know anything to say myself.
I don't
Why?
either.
Right. Seems right.
Okay.
Okay.
Moving right along. The next change is also to comply with state law, and this is for required parking. So the town's current ordinance requires one parking space per bedroom, and state law was amended in 2018, and it reduced the maximum number of spaces to one space regardless of the number of bedrooms or the size of the ADU. So staff is proposing to amend the parking to be consistent with state law. Okay.
We are compliant.
The next change to comply with state law is the current ordinance includes a variety of kind of architectural design standards, and several of them are more subjective in nature. And the intent of the town in the revised ordinance is to create objective design standards. So the staff is recommending to remove some of these more subjective standards. And, we are including landscaping will continue to be a standard, as will lighting, and then also new standards such as the maximum height and windows will help to,
Do we have that one on the slide or no? No. All
no.
right. So that's in. If you want to just refer to the draft of it is in terms of those.
It's attachment 2, and it is section 1831090.
Development standard. And so, we've been tasked currently, as you see, with even architectural style and form. Architectural style and building form shall match the style and form. It creates some difficulty. We want to get rid of that sort of that style of language that just leaves it up to, frankly, some interpretation, I'll call it, in terms of what actually matches, and make it much more clear about what the requirements are. So that you can go down the list and you can see where the same sort of issue arises for the administrator or for myself or any of us who are trying to administrate this in a very objective way, some of the issues. So there are, we talked about, we still think we can get to privacy to a certain degree with some of the windows on side yards, and we're still going to work through specific language regarding that. There's obviously size, location, height is another one that we obviously have talked about tonight. There's lot coverage, there's other things like that. But if the landscaping requirement would remain, there's a couple regarding, obviously there's, we would like to get your impact on just which ones you think we may want to explore further or what. Yes, this is the existing list, and I'm trying to talk to yes, I think yes. And so in any case, 090 in the draft has the number of different things that we have in there today, which, but if there's other things that you think we should be looking at, that specifically, I think here you're looking at what's not included in the proposed list is architectural style and form, architectural details, color, materials, views, and privacy. We've taken a different tack to privacy, and sunlight also was not in there.
Sunlight's not in there either.
But what?
Sunlight, as you see in H, is not in there. So quite a few of those are not.
Could you take A, B, C, D. And rather than keep on saying match, 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 say that the ADU should be compatible with the main house.
Same problem, I think, because compatible is up for, it's really a subjective decision.
Well, I think the other thing is when you say whatever the form of the main building on the site, are you talking about the main building currently on the
So
site?
this is the existing, and I agree, yes.
Because there it is, 159.
I agree.
You had that problem there. And then what happens if 3 years down the line, the main
Changes.
building
Is remodeled.
changes? And there's this ADU that isn't changing either. And I think you have
Right.
to deal with that.
That's why we were proposing to get rid of these.
But shouldn't the ADU, if seen from the street or something like that, fit into one's neighborhood? I mean, you don't want to have a bunch of, I don't know, colonial type, traditional type homes, and all of a sudden you have an ultra-modern building. You want to have some compatibility, and you can find whatever word you want, in the dictionary, but in some way it has to fit in with what is there already.
You have to, the only way to do that is to specifically define what can go there. And it can't be same architectural style.
Guidelines I wanted to do, we'd be able to do that.
No, it's not guidelines. That's exactly no, it's not even state law.
No,
The guidelines don't
would have
work.
specified that these,
That's the
the
point.
types of things. Anyway.
Even in the 1950s ranch homes of my community, can I not distinguish what style half of them are at this point as they've modified to individual taste? It's a trap.
Right. I think there are certain things that, and you could try to get at certain of these issues by, again, height and setback and the
Color.
window placement. Color if you want.
that
But
would
match means it has to be the exact. That color may not even exist anymore because
What if
they don't make
what if
that
it's a
color
stainless
anymore.
steel prefab and you can't
Yeah.
paint it?
That thing that Eli's working on.
So, Charles, let's limit this. What are your thoughts?
So I just quickly evaluated which ones I felt were more subjective and which ones are like things that you could just check off the box. So I would say, no, you cannot easily defend A, B, C, D, or G.
Right.
Like, you can with E, F, H, and I. And G, we've proven time and time again that no matter how good we are at it, we cannot define that. So, but my fear is that it is something that oftentimes wants to be discussed, and so to just fully drop it off could cause its own problems, right? So, that's just my quick evaluation.
So that's the existing.
Yes.
And the proposed here is an 090 in the thing here. So the fact is that these are pretty objective standards here for the most part in the proposed ordinance.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's the
That
whole
was
deal.
intention.
So I think that's the goal, that's what you've achieved with this.
Okay.
Pretty clear.
So, and I'll just say, sunlight is one that I think Commissioner Lee identified, but which we didn't include. But I also agree that if you do it specific, we can, I think on the current, there is a way to do that. I just don't know if it produces the desired results that you want because you may have a certain time of the year.
So I saw you protecting it when we were discussing about the setbacks. You're already thinking about it and basically encapsulating it in other plan measurements that basically preclude them from making that violation. So then you don't need to do it. But if ultimately you say you could encroach more or something like that, then it would flag this. So.
Okay, and this is the last slide. So there are several pending bills in the state legislature related to ADUs. We've touched upon these a little bit. Senate Bill 13 would require an ordinance allow by right an 850 square foot ADU and a 1,000 square foot ADU if the unit contains more than one bedroom. It also proposes to eliminate the owner occupancy requirement, and it would prevent a jurisdiction from requiring for the replacement parking spaces to be required to be elsewhere on site if a garage was demolished or converted to an ADU. And Assembly Bill 2890 would allow for the creation of both an ADU and a JADU on the same property. So again, staff is not recommending these changes at this time. We will continue to track these bills, and if necessary, additional changes may be required in the future.
Makes sense to not do anything, to me, until such a time as these things
Concur.
become reality.
Yeah, I think it's great to alert the public and the commission about current dialogue, though, so thank you.
Okay. That's it.
If you drive to Dillon Beach, they have those portable homes on the water. They're really small, they're really great.
Yeah. And so I would just like to wrap it up. Obviously, the next steps are to take some of this feedback, dive into some of the questions that you've asked us to explore. I'd encourage members of the public to reach out directly to staff, and we've heard your comments here tonight. And continue to stay abreast of sort of future meetings. We'll likely come back. I think there was enough discussion items that need to be sort of discussed again that we would likely come back with, hopefully in the not too distant future, but by sometime in the summer here in the next couple months, with another sort of more more defined or finer grained sort of or narrowed down sort of set of policy recommendations and requirements and based on our discussion this evening. So.
And the timeline you think for that is about what?
So I think probably, so we're into June, probably July. And then I would recommend we start to move into, somewhat like we did with the hotel ordinance, move into transitioning from that discussion. And as you know, in your attachment, you have sort of this, that's why we developed this sort of draft sort of outline or conceptual framework for the ordinance. So it's traveling along, you'll see adjustments to that, but we transition into the actual proposed ordinance that we would then ultimately come back for a formal recommendation and hearing from the commission that ultimately then, if passed, would, it would make its way to the town council for adoption ultimately. So we're trying to get this done. Obviously, this, I think the timeline, the fair timeline is this calendar year, and we'd like to obviously incorporate any of the legislation that ultimately gets approved by the fall, usually by the fall. I think it's by September.
The legislative session will end at the end of June, and we'll know by early July what gets signed by the governor. And so since we're probably coming back, as Adam indicated, with one more step for discussion, we'll probably likely have time to incorporate that into the next proceedings as this moves forward.
They got a lot on their plate. Okay. So we're going to close this item out then. I think so. I want to thank everybody who's borne through this. You guys are tried and true. So glad to see everyone hang out for this scintillating discussion. So thank you. I'm going to say we call it, but I want to just report on two things. And everybody knows the town council approved the marijuana as we second reading.
There's still comes back for a second reading, so it isn't adopted. It's been introduced, so it's scheduled to come back on May 21st for a second reading and adoption.
Okay.
Of what?
Of the cannabis ordinance.
Oh, okay. They approved our recommendation.
but
Yes.
I was told the vote will change next time. So the next thing that I want everybody to know about is that there's been 2 public presentations of the Town Hall Committee for comment. So anybody who's watching or whatever, you can probably get that online, I would think. So they've heard comments from the very few people who did show up, and they're going to take it back to the town manager.
Yeah, this is, for the public, this is regarding, we've had 2 workshops regarding the Town Hall addition proposal, which is a proposal to expand offices for, and public counter for a public permit counter. We've been discussing the location adjacent to this building in the parking lot, and really would be great to hear some additional public feedback. This is now the time to sort of comment on that proposal. So,
Yeah, thank you for that. I just launched into it. But the fact is that there was a location A here and B was over on the other side of Pixley. And it was determined that the other location B was not optimal for a whole host of reasons, including money primarily, taking parkland, other issues. So they're looking at options for adjacent to this building and maximizing the square footage.
and I do want to also just mention that item will come before the commission. So if you are, make sure that you're observing sort of the, not making any statements or issuing any decisions publicly at those prior to that item coming back to the commission at a public hearing for likely design review and maybe some other actions that would be required for that project.
Thank you. All right.
I just want to say I went to the town-sponsored first aid class.
Yeah.
And if anybody here has the opportunity to go to that, they should. It's what a great thing the town has done by offering that. Really, really valuable. It's 5 hours long, and you really get and you get a first aid kit leaving, and certification. But it's such a public benefit. Everybody should take advantage of it.
And it was actually a staff requirement as well, that from our town manager required that all staff
It's
employees
terrific.
do that. So it was.
And the
fairly
guy who
easy.
teaches it is fantastic. It's really valuable.
Right. The other one is this week we also did the climate adaptation planning and met with the public. So I was on the town portion of that before they had the meetings. One was on flood, and they had that over on the east side of town, and then they also addressed fire danger here in town hall. I think that those were well attended and sounded like there were good discussions for those. So.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to go, but I was, never mind. So the, over there, they give you a life vest, and over here, they give you a. Just kidding.
Chainsaw.
Right, okay.
There's also online that the town has put out a questionnaire asking people's opinion on different things having to do with what Charles was just speaking about.
Please go take it and give your feedback. It's valuable, and the town really cares about
So
it.
they
Yeah,
know
so
what steps to take.
there's quite a bit of conversations happening on a number of very important topics, I feel like, and so every chance we have, we should try to get our community members to, if they're not too exhausted by all the different options available to them, to provide feedback and input into those processes. Now's really a great time to do that as these plans and are getting formed and sort of policy ideas are being considered and ultimately for recommendations. Yeah.
So if you're not signed up for the town newsletter, get signed up for the town newsletter. It's full of information, and then nobody can say they weren't told. So please, sign up. Everybody, sign up. Thank you, and good night.
Thank you.